Fairy Tales of Hans Christian Andersen. Hans Christian Andersen. Chapter 76. The Phoenix Bird. In the Garden of Paradise, beneath the tree of knowledge, bloomed a rose bush. Here, in the first rose, a bird was born. His flight was like the flashing of light. His plumage was beauteous, and his song ravishing. But when Eve plucked the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, when she and Adam were driven from paradise, there fell from the flaming sword of the cherub a spark into the nest of the bird, which blazed up forthwith. The bird perished in the flames, but from the red egg in the nest there fluttered aloft a new one, the one solitary phoenix bird. The fable tells that he dwells in Arabia, and that every 100 years, he burns himself to death in his nest, but each time a new phoenix, the only one in the world, rises up from the red egg. The bird flutters round us, swift as light, beauteous in color, charming in song. When a mother sits by her infant's cradle, he stands on the pillow, and, with his wings, forms a glory around the infant's head. He flies through the chamber of content, and brings sunshine into it, and the violets on the humble table smell doubly sweet. But the phoenix is not the bird of Arabia alone. He wings his way in the glimmer of the northern lights over the plains of Lapland, and hops among the yellow flowers in the short Greenland summer. Beneath the copper mountains of Fablun, and England's coal mines, he flies, in the shape of a dusty moth, over the hymn book that rests on the knees of the pious miner. On a lotus leaf he floats down the sacred waters of the Ganges, and the eye of the Hindu maid gleams bright when she beholds him. The phoenix bird, dost thou not know him? The bird of paradise, the holy swan of song. On the car of Thespis he sat in the guise of a chattering raven, and flapped his black wings, smeared with the lees of wine. Over the sounding harp of Iceland swept the swan's red beak. On Shakespeare's shoulder he sat in the guise of Odin's raven, and whispered in the poet's ear immortality. And at the minstrel's feast he fluttered through the halls of the Wartburg. The phoenix bird, dost thou not know him? He sang to thee the Marseillais, and thou kissedst the pen that fell from his wing. He came in the radiance of paradise, and perchance thou didst turn away from him towards the sparrow who sat with tinsel on his wings. The bird of paradise renewed each century, born in flame, ending in flame. Thy picture, in a golden frame, hangs in the halls of the rich, but thou thyself often fleest around, lonely and disregarded, a myth, the phoenix of Arabia, in paradise, when thou wert born in the first rose. Beneath the tree of knowledge, thou receivedst a kiss, and thy right name was given thee, thy name, poetry. Chapter 77. The bird of popular song. It is winter time. The earth wears a snowy garment, and looks like marble hewn out of the rock. The air is bright and clear. The wind is sharp as a well-tempered sword, and the trees stand like branches of white coral or blooming almond twigs, and here it is keen as on the lofty Alps. The night is splendid in the gleam of the northern lights, and in the glitter of innumerable twinkling stars. But we sit in the warm room, by the hot stove, and talk about the old times. And we listen to this story. By the open sea was a giant's grave, and on the grave mound sat at midnight the spirit of the buried hero, who had been a king. The golden circlet gleamed on his brow, his hair fluttered in the wind, and he was clad in steel and iron. He bent his head mournfully, and sighed in deep sorrow, as an unquiet spirit might sigh, and a ship came sailing by. Presently the sailors lowered the anchor and landed. Among them was a singer, and he approached the royal spirit, and said, "Why mournest thou, and wherefore dost thou suffer thus?" And the dead man answered, "No one has sung the deeds of my life, they are dead and forgotten. Song doth not carry them forth over the lands, nor into the hearts of men, therefore I have no rest and no peace." And he spoke of his works, and of his warlike deeds, which his contemporaries had known, but which had not been sung, because there was no singer among his companions. Then the old bard struck the strings of his harp, and sang of the youthful courage of the hero, of the strength of the man, and of the greatness of his good deeds. Then the face of the dead one gleamed like the margin of the cloud in the moonlight. Gladly and of good courage, the form rose in splendor and in majesty, and vanished like the glancing of the northern light. Naught was to be seen but the green turfy mound, with the stones on which no runic records has been graven, but at the last sound of the harp there soared over the hill, as though he had fluttered from the harp, a little bird, a charming singing bird, with ringing voice of the thrush, with the moving voiced pathos of the human heart, with a voice that told of home, like the voice that is heard by the bird of passage. The singing bird soared away, over mountain and valley, over field and wood. He was the bird of popular song, who never dies. We hear his song, we hear it now in the room while the white bees are swarming without, and the storm clutches the windows. The bird sings not alone the requiem of heroes, he sings also sweet gentle songs of love, so many and so warm, of northern fidelity and truth. He has stories in words and in tones. He has proverbs and snatches of proverbs, songs which, like winds laid under a dead man's tongue, force him to speak, and thus popular song tells of the land of his birth, in the old heathen days, in the times of the Vikings. The popular speech was enshrined in the harp of the bard, in the days of knightly castles, when the strongest fist held the scales of justice, when only might was right, and a peasant and a dog were of equal importance. Where did the bird of song find shelter and protection? Neither violence nor stupidity gave him a thought, but in the gabled window of the knightly castle. The lady of the castle sat with a parchment roll before her, and wrote down the old recollections in song and legend, while near her stood the old woman from the wood, and the travelling peddler who went wandering through the country. As these told their tales, there fluttered around them, with twittering and song, the bird of popular song, who never dies so long as the earth has a hill upon which his foot may rest, and now he looks in upon us and sings. Without are the night and the snowstorm. He lays the runes beneath our tongues, and we know the land of our home. Heaven speaks to us in our native tongue, in the voice of the bird of popular song. The old remembrances awake, the faded colors glow with a fresh luster, and story and song pour us a blessed draught which lifts up our minds and our thoughts, so that the evening becomes as a Christmas festival. The snowflakes chase each other, the ice cracks, the storm rules without, for he has the might. He is Lord but not the Lord of all. It is winter time. The wind is sharp as a two-edged sword, the snowflakes chase each other, it seems as though it had been snowing for days and weeks, and the snow lies like a great mountain over the whole town, like a heavy dream of the winter night. Everything on the earth is hidden away, only the golden cross of the church, the symbol of faith, arises over the snow grave, and gleams in the blue air and in the bright sunshine. And over the buried town fly the birds of heaven, the small and the great, they twitter and they sing as best they may, each bird with his beak. First comes the band of sparrows. They pipe at every trifle in the streets and lanes, in the nests and the houses. They have stories to tell about the front buildings and the back buildings. We know the buried town, they say, everything living in it is pipe. 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 The black ravens and crows flew on over the white snow. Grub, grub. They cried. There's something to be got down there, something to swallow, and that's most important. That's the opinion of most of them down there, and the opinion is goo goo good. The wild swans come flying on whirring pinions, and sing of the noble and the great, that will still sprout in the hearts of men, down in the town which is resting beneath its snowy veil. No death is the life reigns yonder, we hear it on the notes that swell onward like the tones of the church organ, which sees us like sounds from the elf hill, like the songs of Ossian, like the rushing swoop of the wandering spirit's wings. What harmony! That harmony speaks to our hearts, and lifts up our souls. It is the bird of popular song whom we hear, and at this moment the warm breath of heaven blows down from the sky. There are gaps in the snowy mountains, the sun shines into the clefts, spring is coming, the birds are returning, and new races are coming with the same home sounds in their hearts. Hear the story of the year, the night of the snowstorm, the heavy dream of the winter night, all shall be dissolved, all shall rise again in the beauteous notes of the bird of popular song, who never dies. Chapter 78 The Portuguese Duck. A duck once arrived from Portugal, but there were some who said she came from Spain, which is almost the same thing. At all events, she was called the Portuguese, and she laid eggs, was killed, and cooked, and there was an end of her. But the ducklings which crept forth from the eggs were also called Portuguese, and about that there may be some question. But of all the family one only remained in the duckyard, which may be called a farmyard, as the chickens were admitted, and the cock strutted about in a very hostile manner. He annoys me with his loud crowing, said the Portuguese duck, but, still, he's a handsome bird, there's no denying that, although he's not a drake. He ought to moderate his voice, like those little birds who are singing in the lime trees over there in our neighbor's garden, but that is an art only acquired in polite society. How sweetly they sing there, it is quite a pleasure to listen to them. I call it Portuguese singing. If I had only such a little singing bird, I'd be kind and good as a mother to him, for it's in my nature, in my Portuguese blood. While she was speaking, one of the little singing birds came tumbling head over heels from the roof into the yard. The cat was after him, but he had escaped from her with a broken wing, and so came tumbling into the yard. That's just like the cat, she's a villain, said the Portuguese duck. I remember her ways when I had children of my own. How can such a creature be allowed to live, and wander about upon the roofs? I don't think they allow such things in Portugal. She pitied the little singing bird, and so did all the other ducks who were not Portuguese. Poor little creature. They said, one after another, as they came up. We can't sing, certainly, but we have a sounding board, or something of the kind, within us. We can feel that, though we don't talk about it. But I can talk, said the Portuguese duck, and I'll do something for the little fellow. It's my duty. And she stepped into the water trough, and beat her wings upon the water so strongly that the bird was nearly drowned by a shower bath, but the duck meant it kindly. That is a good deed, she said. I hope the others will take example by it. Tweet, tweet, said the little bird, for one of his wings being broken, he found it difficult to shake himself, but he quite understood that the bath was meant kindly, and he said, You are very kind-hearted, madame, but he did not wish for a second bath. I have never thought about my heart, replied the Portuguese duck, but I know that I love all my fellow creatures, except the cat, and nobody can expect me to love her, for she ate up 2 of my ducklings. But pray make yourself at home, it is easy to make oneself comfortable. I am myself from a foreign country, as you may see by my feathery dress. My drake is a native of these parts. He's not of my race, but I am not proud on that account. If anyone here can understand you, I may say positively I am that person. She's quite full of portulac, said a little common duck, who was witty. All the common ducks considered the word portulac a good joke, for it sounded like Portugal. They nudged each other, and said, Quack. That was witty. Then the other ducks began to notice the little bird. The Portuguese had certainly a great flow of language. They said to the little bird, For our part we don't care to fill our beaks with such long words, but we sympathize with you quite as much. If we don't do anything else, we can walk about with you everywhere, and we think that is the best thing we can do. You have a lovely voice, said one of the eldest ducks. It must be great satisfaction to you to be able to give so much pleasure as you do. I am certainly no judge of your singing, so I keep my beak shut, which is better than talking nonsense, as others do. Don't plague him so, interposed the Portuguese duck. He requires rest and nursing. My little singing bird, do you wish me to prepare another bath for you? Oh, no. No. Pray let me dry, implored the little bird. The water cure is the only remedy for me, when I am not well, said the Portuguese. Amusement, too, is very beneficial. The fowls from the neighborhood will soon be here to pay you a visit. There are 2 Cochin Chinese amongst them. They wear feathers on their legs, and are well educated. They have been brought from a great distance, and consequently I treat them with greater respect than I do the others. Then the fowls arrived, and the cock was polite enough today to keep from being rude. You are a real songster, he said. You do as much with your little voice as it is possible to do. But there requires more noise and shrillness in anyone who wishes it to be known who he is. The 2 Chinese were quite enchanted with the appearance of the singing bird. His feathers had been much ruffled by his bath, so that he seemed to them quite like a tiny Chinese fowl. He's charming, they said to each other, and began a conversation with him in whispers, using the most aristocratic Chinese dialect. We are of the same race as yourself, they said. The ducks, even the Portuguese, are all aquatic birds, as you must have noticed. You do not know us yet, very few know us, or give themselves the trouble to make our acquaintance, not even any of the fowls, though we are born to occupy a higher grade in society than most of them. But that does not disturb us, we quietly go on in our own way among the rest, whose ideas are certainly not ours, for we look at the bright side of things, and only speak what is good, although that is sometimes very difficult to find where none exists. Except ourselves and the cock, there is not one in the yard who can be called talented or polite. It cannot even be said of the ducks, and we warn you, little bird, not to trust that one yonder, with the short tail feathers, for she is cunning. That curiously marked one, with the crooked stripes on her wings, is a mischief maker, and never lets anyone have the last word, though she is always in the wrong. That fat duck yonder speaks evil of everyone, and that is against our principles. If we have nothing good to tell, we close our beaks. The Portuguese is the only one who has had any education, and with whom we can associate, but she is passionate, and talks too much about Portugal. I wonder what those 2 Chinese are whispering about, whispered one duck to another. They are always doing it, and it annoys me. We never speak to them. Now the drake came up, and he thought the little singing bird was a sparrow. Well, I don't understand the difference, he said. It appears to me all the same. He's only a plaything, and if people will have playthings, why let them, I say. Don't take any notice of what he says, whispered the Portuguese. He's very well in matters of business, and with him business is placed before everything. But now I shall lie down and have a little rest. It is a duty we owe to ourselves that we may be nice and fat when he come to be embalmed with sage and onions and apples. So she laid herself down in the sun and winked with one eye. She had a very comfortable place, and felt so comfortable that she fell asleep. The little singing bird busied himself for some time with his broken wing, and at last he lay down, too, quite close to his protectress. The sun shone warm and bright, and he found out that it was a very good place. But the fowls of the neighborhood were all awake, and, to tell the truth, they had paid a visit to the duckyard, simply and solely to find food for themselves. The Chinese were the first to leave, and the other fowls soon followed them. The witty little duck said of the Portuguese, that the old lady was getting quite a doting ducky. All the other ducks laughed at this. "Doting ducky," they whispered. "Oh, that's too witty." And then they repeated the former joke about Portulak, and declared it was most amusing. Then they all lay down to have a nap. They had been lying asleep for some time, when suddenly something was thrown into the yard for them to eat. It came down with such a bang, that the whole company started up and clapped their wings. The Portuguese awoke too, and rushed over to the other side. In so doing she trod upon the little singing bird. "Tweet," he cried, "you trod very hard upon me." "Madame, well, then, why do you lie in my way?" She retorted, "You must not be so touchy. I have nerves of my own, but I do not cry." "Tweet, don't be angry," said the little bird, "the tweet slipped out of my beak unawares." The Portuguese did not listen to him, but began eating as fast as she could, and made a good meal. When she had finished, she lay down again, and the little bird, who wished to be amiable, began to sing, chirp and twitter. The dewdrops glitter. In the hours of sunny spring, I'll sing my best, till I go to rest, with my head behind my wing. "Now I want rest after my dinner," said the Portuguese. "You must conform to the rules of the house while you are here. I want to sleep now." The little bird was quite taken aback, for he meant it kindly. When Madame awoke afterwards, there he stood before her with a little corn he had found, and laid it at her feet, but as she had not slept well, she was naturally in a bad temper. "Give that to a chicken," she said, "and don't be always standing in my way." "Why are you angry with me?" replied the little singing bird. "What have I done?" "Done?" repeated the Portuguese duck. "Your mode of expressing yourself is not very polite. I must call your attention to that fact. It was sunshine here yesterday," said the little bird, "but today it is cloudy and the air is close. You know very little about the weather, I fancy," she retorted. "The day is not over yet. Don't stand there, looking so stupid. But you are looking at me just as the wicked eyes looked when I fell into the yard yesterday." "Impertinent creature!" exclaimed the Portuguese duck. "Would you compare me with a cat, that beast of prey? There's not a drop of malicious blood in me. I've taken your part, and now I'll teach you better manners." So saying, she made a bite at the little singing bird's head, and he fell dead on the ground. "Now whatever is the meaning of this?" she said. "Could he not bear even such a little peck as I gave him? Then certainly he was not made for this world. I've been like a mother to him, I know that, for I've a good heart." Then the cock from the neighboring yard stuck his head in, and crowed with steam engine power. "You'll kill me with your crowing," she cried. "It's all your fault. He's lost his life, and I'm very near losing mine." "There's not much of him lying there," observed the cock. "Speak of him with respect," said the Portuguese duck, for he had manners and education, and he could sing. He was affectionate and gentle, and that is as rare a quality in animals as in those who call themselves human beings. Then all the ducks came crowding round the little dead bird. Ducks have strong passions, whether they feel envy or pity. There was nothing to envy here, so they all showed a great deal of pity, even the two Chinese. "We shall never have another singing bird again amongst us, he was almost a Chinese," they whispered, and then they wept with such a noisy, clucking sound, that all the other fowls clucked too, but the ducks went about with redder eyes afterwards. "We have hearts of our own," they said. "Nobody can deny that." "Hearts," repeated the Portuguese. "Indeed you have, almost as tender as the ducks in Portugal." "Let us think of getting something to satisfy our hunger," said the drake. "That's the most important business. If one of our toys is broken, why we have plenty more." Chapter 79. The Porter's Son. The general lived in the grand first floor, and the porter lived in the cellar. There was a great distance between the two families, the whole of the ground floor, and the difference in rank, but they lived in the same house, and both had a view of the street, and of the courtyard. In the courtyard was a grass plot, on which grew a blooming acacia tree, when it was in bloom, and under this tree sat occasionally the finely dressed nurse, with the still more finely dressed child of the general, little Emily. Before them danced about barefoot the little son of the porter, with his great brown eyes and dark hair, and the little girl smiled at him, and stretched out her hands towards him, and when the general saw that from the window, he would nod his head and cry, "Charming." The general's lady, who was so young that she might very well have been her husband's daughter from an early marriage, never came to the window that looked upon the courtyard. She had given orders, though, that the boy might play his antics to amuse her child, but must never touch it. The nurse punctually obeyed the gracious lady's orders. The sun shone in upon the people in the grand first floor, and upon the people in the cellar. The acacia tree was covered with blossoms, and they fell off, and next year new ones came. The tree bloomed, and the porter's little son bloomed too, and looked like a fresh tulip. The general's little daughter became delicate and pale, like the leaf of the acacia blossom. She seldom came down to the tree now, for she took the air in a carriage. She drove out with her mamma, and then she would always nod at the porter's George. Yes, she used even to kiss her hand to him, till her mamma said she was too old to do that now. One morning George was sent up to carry the general the letters and newspapers that had been delivered at the porter's room in the morning. As he was running upstairs, just as he passed the door of the sandbox, he heard a faint piping. He thought it was some young chicken that had strayed there, and was raising cries of distress, but it was the general's little daughter, decked out in lace and finery. "Don't tell Papa and Mama," she whimpered, "they would be angry." "What's the matter, little missy?" asked George. "It's all on fire," she answered. "It's burning with a bright flame." George hurried upstairs to the general's apartments. He opened the door of the nursery. The window curtain was almost entirely burnt, and the wooden curtain pole was one mass of flame. George sprang upon a chair he brought in haste, and pulled down the burning articles. He then alarmed the people. But for him, the house would have been burned down. The general and his lady cross-questioned little Emily. "I only took just one lucifer match," she said, "and it was burning directly, and the curtain was burning too. I spat at it, to put it out. I spat at it as much as ever I could, but I could not put it out, so I ran away and hid myself, for Papa and Mama would be angry. I spat," cried the general's lady. "What an expression! Did you ever hear your Papa and Mama talk about spitting? You must have got that from downstairs." And George had a penny given him. But this penny did not go to the baker's shop, but into the savings box, and soon there were so many pennies in the savings box that he could buy a paint box and color the drawings he made, and he had a great number of drawings. They seemed to shoot out of his pencil and out of his fingers' ends. His first colored pictures he presented to Emily. "Charming," said the general, and even the general's lady acknowledged that it was easy to see what the boy had meant to draw. "He is genius." Those were the words that were carried down into the cellar. The general and his gracious lady were grand people. They had 2 coats of arms on their carriage, a coat of arms for each of them, and the gracious lady had had this coat of arms embroidered on both sides of every bit of linen she had, and even on her nightcap and her dressing bag. One of the coats of arms, the one that belonged to her, was a very dear one. It had been bought for hard cash by her father, for he had not been born with it, nor had she. She had come into the world too early, 7 years before the coat of arms, and most people remembered this circumstance, but the family did not remember it. A man might well have a bee in his bonnet, when he had such a coat of arms to carry as that, let alone having to carry 2, and the general's wife had a bee in hers when she drove to the court ball, as stiff and as proud as you please. The general was old and grey, but he had a good seat on horseback, and he knew it, and he rode out every day, with a groom behind him at a proper distance. When he came to a party, he looked somehow as if he were riding into the room upon his high horse, and he had orders, too, such a number that no one would have believed it, but that was not his fault. As a young man he had taken part in the great autumn reviews which were held in those days. He had an anecdote that he told about those days, the only one he knew. A subaltern under his orders had cut off one of the princes, and taken him prisoner, and the prince had been obliged to ride through the town with a little band of captured soldiers, himself a prisoner behind the general. This was an ever memorable event, and was always told over and over again every year by the general, who, moreover, always repeated the remarkable words he had used when he returned his sword to the prince. Those words were, "Only my subaltern could have taken your highness prisoner, I could never have done it." And the prince had replied, "You are incomparable." In a real war the general had never taken part. When war came into the country, he had gone on a diplomatic career to foreign courts. He spoke the French language so fluently that he had almost forgotten his own. He could dance well, he could ride well, and orders grew on his coat in an astounding way. The sentries presented arms to him. One of the most beautiful girls presented arms to him, and became the general's lady, and in time they had a pretty, charming child, that seemed as if it had dropped from heaven. It was so pretty, and the porter's son danced before it in the courtyard, as soon as it could understand it, and gave her all his colored pictures, and little Emily looked at them, and was pleased, and tore them to pieces. She was pretty and delicate indeed, my little Rosa Leaf. cried the general's lady, "thou art born to wed a prince." The prince was already at the door, but they knew nothing of it. People don't see far beyond the threshold. "The day before yesterday our boy divided his bread and butter with her," said the porter's wife. "There was neither cheese nor meat upon it, but she liked it as well as if it had been roast beef." There would have been a fine noise if the general and his wife had seen the feast, but they did not see it. George had divided his bread and butter with little Emily, and he would have divided his heart with her, if it would have pleased her. He was a good boy, brisk and clever, and he went to the night school in the academy now, to learn to draw properly. Little Emily was getting on with her education too, for she spoke French with her bonne, and had a dancing master. "George will be confirmed at Easter," said the porter's wife, for George had got so far as this. "It would be the best thing, now, to make an apprentice of him," said his father. "It must be to some good calling and then he would be out of the house." "He would have to sleep out of the house," said George's mother. "It is not easy to find a master who has room for him at night, and we shall have to provide him with clothes too. The little bit of eating that he wants can be managed for him, for he's quite happy with a few boiled potatoes, and he gets taught for nothing. Let the boy go his own way. You will say that he will be our joy some day, and the professor says so too." The confirmation suit was ready. The mother had worked it herself, but the tailor who did repairs had cut them out, and a capital cutter out he was. If he had had a better position, and been able to keep a workshop under a journeyman, the porter's wife said, he might have been a court tailor. The clothes were ready, and the candidate for confirmation was ready. On his confirmation day, George received a great pinchbeck watch from his godfather, the old ironmonger's shopman, the richest of his godfathers. The watch was an old and tried servant. It always went too fast, but that is better than to be lagging behind. That was a costly present. And from the general's apartment there arrived the hymn book bound in Morocco, sent by the little lady to whom George had given pictures. At the beginning of the book his name was written, and her name, as his gracious patroness. These words had been written at the dictation of the general's lady, and the general had read the inscription, and pronounced it charming. "That is really a great attention from a family of such position," said the porter's wife, and George was sent upstairs to show himself in his confirmation clothes, with the hymn book in his hand. The general's lady was sitting very much wrapped up, and had the bad headache she always had when time hung heavy upon her hands. She looked at George very pleasantly, and wished him all prosperity, and that he might never have her headache. The general was walking about in his dressing gown. He had a cap with a long tassel on his head, and Russian boots with red tops on his feet. He walked 3 times up and down the room, absorbed in his own thoughts and recollections, and then stopped and said, "So little George is a confirmed Christian now. Be a good man, and honor those in authority over you. Some day, when you are an old man, you can say that the general gave you this precept." That was a longer speech than the general was accustomed to make, and then he went back to his ruminations, and looked very aristocratic. But of all that George heard and saw up there, little Miss Emily remained most clear in his thoughts. How graceful she was, how gentle, and flattering, and pretty she looked. If she were to be drawn, it ought to be on a soap bubble. About her dress, about her yellow curled hair, there was a fragrance as of a fresh-blown rose, and to think that he had once divided his bread and butter with her, and that she had eaten it with enormous appetite, and nodded to him at every second mouthful. Did she remember anything about it? Yes, certainly, for she had given him the beautiful hymn book in remembrance of this. And when the first new moon in the first new year after this event came round, he took a piece of bread, a penny, and his hymn book, and went out into the open air, and opened the book to see what psalm he should turn up. It was a psalm of praise and thanksgiving. Then he opened the book again to see what would turn up for little Emily. He took great pains not to open the book in the place where the funeral hymns were, and yet he got one that referred to the grave and death. But then he thought this was not a thing in which one must believe, for all that he was startled when soon afterwards the pretty little girl had to lie in bed, and the doctor's carriage stopped at the gate every day. "They will not keep her with them," said the porter's wife. "The good God knows whom he will summon to himself," but they kept her after all, and George drew pictures and sent them to her. He drew the Tsar's palace, the old Kremlin at Moscow, just as it stood, with towers and cupolas, and these cupolas looked like gigantic green and gold cucumbers, at least in George's drawing. Little Emily was highly pleased, and consequently, when a week had elapsed, George sent her a few more pictures, all with buildings in them, for, you see, she could imagine all sorts of things inside the windows and doors. He drew a Chinese house, with bells hanging from every one of 16 stories. He drew 2 Grecian temples with slender marble pillars, and with steps all round them. he drew a Norwegian church. It was easy to see that this church had been built entirely of wood, hewn out and wonderfully put together. Every story looked as if it had rockers, like a cradle. But the most beautiful of all was the castle, drawn on one of the leaves, and which he called Emily's castle. This was the kind of place in which she must live. That is what George had thought, and consequently he had put into this building whatever he thought most beautiful in all the others. It had carved woodwork, like the Norwegian church, marble pillars, like the Grecian temple, bells in every story, and was crowned with cupolas, green and gilded, like those of the Kremlin of the Tsar. It was a real child's castle, and under every window was written what the hall or the room inside was intended to be. For instance, here Emily sleeps, here Emily dances, here Emily plays at receiving visitors. It was a real pleasure to look at the castle, and right well was the castle looked at accordingly. Charming, said the general, but the old count, for there was an old count there, who was still grander than the general, and had a castle of his own, said nothing at all. He heard that it had been designed and drawn by the porter's little son. Not that he was so very little, either, for he had already been confirmed. The old count looked at the pictures, and had his own thoughts as he did so. One day, when it was very gloomy, grey, wet weather, the brightest of days dawned for George, for the professor at the academy called him into his room. "Listen to me, my friend," said the professor, "I want to speak to you. The Lord has been good to you in giving you abilities, and he has also been good in placing you among kind people. The old count at the corner yonder has been speaking to me about you. I have also seen your sketches, but we will not say any more about those, for there is a good deal to correct in them. But from this time forward you may come twice a week to my drawing class, and then you will soon learn how to do them better. I think there's more of the architect than of the painter in you. You will have time to think that over, but go across to the old count this very day, and thank God for having sent you such a friend." It was a great house, the house of the old count at the corner. Round the windows elephants and dromedaries were carved, all from the old times, but the old count loved the new time best, and what it brought, whether it came from the first floor, or from the cellar, or from the attic. "I think," said the porter's wife, "the grander people are, the fewer airs do they give themselves. How kind and straightforward the old count is. And he talks exactly like you and me. Now, the general and his lady can't do that." And George was fairly wild with delight yesterday at the good reception he met with at the count's, and so am I today, after speaking to the great man. Wasn't it a good thing that we didn't bind George apprentice to a handicraftsman? For he has abilities of his own. But they must be helped on by others, said the father. "That help he has got now," rejoined the mother, for the count spoke out quite clearly and distinctly. "But I fancy it began with the general," said the father, "and we must thank them too." "Let us do so with all my heart," cried the mother, "though I fancy we have not much to thank them for. I will thank the good God, and I will thank him, too, for letting little Emily get well." Emily was getting on bravely, and George got on bravely too. In the course of the year he won the little silver prize medal of the academy, and afterwards he gained the great one too. "It would have been better, after all, if he had been apprenticed to a handicraftsman," said the porter's wife, weeping, "for then we could have kept him with us. What is he to do in Rome? I shall never get a sight of him again, not even if he comes back, but that he won't do, the dear boy. It is fortune and fame for him," said the father. "Yes, thank you, my friend," said the mother, "you are saying what you do not mean. You are just as sorrowful as I am." And it was all true about the sorrow and the journey. But everybody said it was a great piece of good fortune for the young fellow. And he had to take leave, and of the general too. The general's lady did not show herself, for she had her bad headache. On this occasion the general told his only anecdote, about what he had said to the prince, and how the prince had said to him, "You are incomparable." And he held out a languid hand to George. Emily gave George her hand too, and looked almost sorry, and George was the most sorry of all. Time goes by when one has something to do, and it goes by, too, when one has nothing to do. The time is equally long, but not equally useful. It was useful to George, and did not seem long at all, except when he happened to be thinking of his home. How might the good folks be getting on, upstairs and downstairs? Yes, there was writing about that, and many things can be put into a letter: bright sunshine and dark, heavy days. Both of these were in the letter which brought the news that his father was dead, and that his mother was alone now. She wrote that Emily had come down to see her, and had been to her like an angel of comfort, and concerning herself, she added that she had been allowed to keep her situation as portress. The general's lady kept a diary, and in this diary was recorded every ball she attended and every visit she received. The diary was illustrated by the insertion of the visiting cards of the diplomatic circle and of the most noble families, and the general's lady was proud of it. The diary kept growing through a long time, and amid many severe headaches, and through a long course of half-nights, that is to say, of court balls. Emily had now been to a court ball for the first time. Her mother had worn a bright red dress, with black lace, in the Spanish style. The daughter had been attired in white, fair and delicate. Green silk ribbons fluttered like flag leaves among her yellow locks, and on her head she wore a wreath of water lilies. Her eyes were so blue and clear, her mouth was so delicate and red, she looked like a little water spirit, as beautiful as such a spirit can be imagined. The princes danced with her, one after another of course, and the general's lady had not a headache for a week afterwards. But the first ball was not the last, and Emily could not stand it. It was a good thing, therefore, that summer brought with it rest and exercise in the open air. The family had been invited by the old count to visit him at Im Castle. That was a castle with a garden which was worth seeing. Part of this garden was laid out quite in the style of the old days, with stiff green hedges. You walked as if between green walls with peepholes in them. Box trees and yew trees stood trimmed into the form of stars and pyramids, and water sprang from fountains in large grottos lined with shells. All around stood figures of the most beautiful stone that could be seen in their clothes as well as in their faces. Every flower bed had a different shape, and represented a fish, or a coat of arms, or a monogram. That was the French part of the garden, and from this part the visitor came into what appeared like the green, fresh forest, where the trees might grow as they chose, and accordingly they were great and glorious. The grass was green, and beautiful to walk on, and it was regularly cut, and rolled, and swept, and tended. That was the English part of the garden. Old time and new time, said the count, here they run well into one another. In 2 years the building itself will put on a proper appearance, there will be a complete metamorphosis in beauty and improvement. I shall show you the drawings, and I shall show you the architect, for he is to dine here today. Charming, said the general. 'Tis like paradise here, said the general's lady, and yonder you have a knight's castle. That's my poultry house, observed the count. The pigeons live in the tower, the turkeys in the first floor, but old Elsie rules in the ground floor. She has apartments on all sides of her. The sitting hens have their own room, and the hens with chickens have theirs, and the ducks have their own particular door leading to the water. Charming, repeated the general, and all sailed forth to see these wonderful things. Old Elsie stood in the room on the ground floor, and by her side stood architect George. He and Emily now met for the first time after several years, and they met in the poultry house. Yes, there he stood, and was handsome enough to be looked at. His face was frank and energetic, he had black shining hair, and a smile about his mouth, which said, I had a brownie that sits in my ear, and knows every one of you, inside and out. Old Elsie had pulled off her wooden shoes, and stood there in her stockings, to do honor to the noble guests. The hens clucked, and the cocks crowed, and the ducks waddled to and fro, and said, quack, quack. But the fair, pale girl, the friend of his childhood, the daughter of the general, stood there with a rosy blush on her usually pale cheeks, and her eyes opened wide, and her mouth seemed to speak without uttering a word, and the greeting he received from her was the most beautiful greeting a young man can desire from a young lady, if they are not related, or have not danced many times together, and she and the architect had never danced together. The count shook hands with him, and introduced him. He is not altogether a stranger, our young friend George. The general's lady bowed to him, and the general's daughter was very nearly giving him her hand, but she did not give it to him. Our little master George, said the general. Old friends. Charming, you have become quite an Italian, said the general's lady, and I presume you speak the language like a native? My wife sings the language, but she does not speak it, observed the general. At dinner, George sat at the right hand of Emily, whom the general had taken down, while the count led in the general's lady. Mr. George talked and told of his travels, and he could talk well, and was the life and soul of the table, though the old count could have been it too. Emily sat silent, but she listened, and her eyes gleamed, but she said nothing. In the veranda, among the flowers, she and George stood together, the rose bushes concealed them. And George was speaking again, for he took the lead now. Many thanks for the kind consideration you showed my old mother, he said. I know that you went down to her on the night when my father died, and you stayed with her till his eyes were closed. My heartiest thanks. He took Emily's hand and kissed it. He might do so on such an occasion. She blushed deeply, but pressed his hand, and looked at him with her dear blue eyes. Your mother was a dear soul, she said. How fond she was of her son. And she let me read all your letters, so that I almost believe I know you. How kind you were to me when I was a little girl. You used to give me pictures, which you tore in two," said George. "No, I have still your drawing of the castle. I must build the castle in reality now," said George, and he became quite warm at his own words. The general and the general's lady talked to each other in their room about the porter's son, how he knew how to behave, and to express himself with the greatest propriety. "He might be a tutor," said the general. "Intellect," said the general's lady, but she did not say anything more. During the beautiful summertime Mr. George several times visited the Count at his castle, and he was missed when he did not come. "How much the good God has given you that he has not given to us poor mortals," said Emily to him. "Are you sure you are very grateful for it?" It flattered George that the lovely young girl should look up to him, and he thought then that Emily had unusually good abilities. And the general felt more and more convinced that George was no cellar child. "His mother was a very good woman," he observed. "It is only right I should do her that justice now she is in her grave." The summer passed away, and the winter came. Again there was talk about Mr. George. He was highly respected, and was received in the first circles. The general had met him at a court ball, and now there was a ball to be given in the general's house for Emily, and could Mr. George be invited to it? "He whom the king invites can be invited by the general also," said the general, and drew himself up till he stood quite an inch higher than before. Mr. George was invited, and he came. Princes and counts came, and they danced, one better than the other. But Emily could only dance one dance the first, for she made a false step, nothing of consequence, but her foot hurt her, so that she had to be careful, and leave off dancing, and look at the others. So she sat and looked on, and the architect stood by her side. "I suppose you are giving her the whole history of St. Peter's," said the general, as he passed by, and smiled, like the personification of patronage. With the same patronizing smile he received Mr. George a few days afterwards. The young man came, no doubt, to return thanks for the invitation to the ball. What else could it be? But indeed there was something else, something very astonishing and startling. He spoke words of sheer lunacy, so that the general could hardly believe his own ears. It was the height of rhodomontade, an offer, quite an inconceivable offer. Mr. George came to ask the hand of Emily in marriage. "Man!" cried the general, and his brain seemed to be boiling. "I don't understand you at all. What is it you say? What is it you want? I don't know you." "Sir." "Man! What possesses you to break into my house? And am I to stand here and listen to you?" He stepped backwards into his bedroom, locked the door behind him, and left Mr. George standing alone. George stood still for a few minutes, and then turned round and left the room. Emily was standing in the corridor. "My father has answered," she said, and her voice trembled. George pressed her hand. "He has escaped me," he replied, "but a better time will come." There were tears in Emily's eyes, but in the young man's eyes shone courage and confidence, and the sun shone through the window, and cast his beams on the pair, and gave them his blessing. The general sat in his room, bursting hot. Yes, he was still boiling, until he boiled over in the exclamation, "Lunacy! Porter! Madness!" Not an hour was over before the general's lady knew it out of the general's own mouth. She called Emily, and remained alone with her. "You poor child," she said, "to insult you so! To insult us so! There are tears in your eyes, too, but they become you well. You look beautiful in tears. You look as I looked on my wedding day. Weep on, my sweet Emily." "Yes, that I must," said Emily, "if you and my father do not say yes, child," screamed the general's lady. "You are ill. You are talking wildly, and I shall have a most terrible headache. Oh, what a misfortune is coming upon our house. Don't make your mother die, Emily, or you will have no mother." And the eyes of the general's lady were wet, for she could not bear to think of her own death. In the newspapers there was an announcement. "Mr. George has been elected professor of the 5th class, number 8. It's a pity that his parents are dead and cannot read it," said the new Porter people, who now lived in the cellar under the general's apartments. They knew that the professor had been born and grown up within their 4 walls. "Now he'll get a salary," said the man. "Yes, that's not much for a poor child," said the woman. $18 a year, said the man. "Why, it's a good deal of money." "No, I mean the honor of it," replied the wife. "Do you think he cares for the money? Those few dollars he can earn 100 times over, and most likely he'll get a rich wife into the bargain. If we had children of our own, husband, our child should be an architect and a professor too." George was spoken well of in the cellar, and he was spoken well of in the first floor. The old count took upon himself to do that. The pictures he had drawn in his childhood gave occasion for it. But how did the conversation come to turn on these pictures? Why, they had been talking of Russia and of Moscow, and thus mention was made of the Kremlin, which little George had once drawn for Miss Emily. He had drawn many pictures, but the Count especially remembered one, Emily's castle, where she was to sleep, and to dance, and to play at receiving guests. The professor was a true man, said the Count, and would be a privy councillor before he died. It was not at all unlikely, and he might build a real castle for the young lady before that time came. Why not? That was a strange jest, remarked the general's lady, when the Count had gone away. The general shook his head thoughtfully, and went out for a ride, with his groom behind him at a proper distance, and he sat more stiffly than ever on his high horse. It was Emily's birthday. Flowers, books, letters, and visiting cards came pouring in. The general's lady kissed her on the mouth, and the general kissed her on the forehead. They were affectionate parents, and they and Emily had to receive grand visitors, 2 of the princes. They talked of balls and theatres, of diplomatic missions, of the government of empires and nations, and then they spoke of talent, native talent, and so the discourse turned upon the young architect. He is building up an immortality for himself, said one, and he will certainly build his way into one of our first families, one of our first families, repeated the general, and afterwards the general's lady. What is meant by one of our first families? I know for whom it was intended, said the general's lady, but I shall not say it. I don't think it. Heaven disposes, but I shall be astonished. I am astonished also, said the general. I haven't an idea in my head. And he fell into the reverie, waiting for ideas. There is a power, a nameless power, in the possession of favor from above, the favor of Providence, and this favor little George had. But we are forgetting the birthday. Emily's room was fragrant with flowers, sent by male and female friends. On the table lay beautiful presents for greeting and remembrance, but none could come from George, none could come from him, but it was not necessary, for the whole house was full of remembrances of him. Even out of the ash bin the blossom of memory peeped forth, for Emily had sat whimpering there on the day when the window curtain caught fire, and George arrived in the character of fire engine. A glance out of the window, and the acacia tree reminded of the days of childhood. Flowers and leaves had fallen, but there stood the tree covered with hoarfrost, looking like a single huge branch of coral, and the moon shone clear and large among the twigs, unchanged in its changings, as it was when George divided his bread and butter with little Emily. Out of a box the girl took the drawings of the Tsar's palace and of her own castle, remembrances of George. The drawings were looked at, and many thoughts came. She remembered the day when, unobserved by her father and mother, she had gone down to the porter's wife who lay dying. Once again she seemed to sit beside her, holding the dying woman's hand in hers, hearing the dying woman's last words, blessing George. The mother was thinking of her son, and now Emily gave her own interpretation to those words. Yes, George was certainly with her on her birthday. It happened that the next day was another birthday in that house, the general's birthday. He had been born the day after his daughter, but before her, of course, many years before her. Many presents arrived, and among them came a saddle of exquisite workmanship, a comfortable and costly saddle. One of the princes had just such another. Now, from whom might this saddle come? The general was delighted. There was a little note with the saddle. Now if the words on the note had been "Many thanks for yesterday's reception," we might easily have guessed from whom it came. But the words were from somebody whom the general does not know. Whom in the world do I not know? Exclaimed the general. I know everybody, and his thoughts wandered all through society, for he knew everybody there. That saddle comes from my wife, he said at last. She is teasing me, charming, but she was not teasing him. Those times were past. Again there was a feast, but it was not in the general's house. It was a fancy ball at the prince's, and masks were allowed too. The general went as Rubens, in a Spanish costume, with a little ruff round his neck, a sword by his side, and a stately manner. The general's lady was Madame Rubens, in black velvet made high round the neck, exceedingly warm, and with a millstone round her neck in the shape of a great ruff, accurately dressed after a Dutch picture in the possession of the general, in which the hands were especially admired. They were just like the hands of the general's lady. Emily was Psyche. In white crepe and lace she was like a floating swan. She did not want wings at all. She only wore them as emblematic of Psyche. Brightness, splendor, light and flowers, wealth and taste appeared at the ball. There was so much to see, that the beautiful hands of Madame Rubens made no sensation at all. A black domino, with an acacia blossom in his cap, danced with Psyche. Who is that? Asked the general's lady. His Royal Highness, replied the general. I am quite sure of it. I knew him directly by the pressure of his hand. The general's lady doubted it. General Rubens had no doubts about it. he went up to the black domino and wrote the royal letters in the mask's hand. These were denied, but the mask gave him a hint. The words that came with the saddle: "One whom you do not know, General, but I do know you," said the general. "It was you who sent me the saddle." The domino raised his hand, and disappeared among the other guests. "Who was that black domino with whom you were dancing, Emily?" asked the general's lady. "I did not ask his name," she replied, "because you knew it. It is the professor. Your protégé is here, Count," she continued, turning to that nobleman, who stood close by. "A black domino with acacia blossoms in his cap, very likely, my dear lady," replied the Count. "But one of the princes wears just the same costume." "I knew the pressure of the hand," said the general. "The saddle came from the prince. I am so certain of it that I could invite that domino to dinner." "Do so. If it be the prince he will certainly come," replied the Count. "And if it is the other he will not come," said the general, and approached the black domino, who was just speaking with the king. The general gave a very respectful invitation that they might make each other's acquaintance, and he smiled in his certainty concerning the person he was inviting. He spoke loud and distinctly. The domino raised his mask, and it was George. "Do you repeat your invitation, General?" he asked. The general certainly seemed to grow an inch taller, assumed a more stately demeanor, and took 2 steps backward and 1 step forward, as if he were dancing a minuet, and then came as much gravity and expression into the face of the general as the general could contrive to infuse into it, but he replied, "I never retract my words. You are invited, Professor." And he bowed with a glance at the king, who must have heard the whole dialogue. Now, there was a company to dinner at the general's, but only the old count and his protégé were invited. "I have my foot under his table," thought George. "That's laying the foundation stone," and the foundation stone was really laid, with great ceremony, at the house of the general and of the general's lady. The man had come, and had spoken quite like a person in good society, and had made himself very agreeable, so that the general had often to repeat his charming. The general talked of this dinner, talked of it even to a court lady, and this lady, one of the most intellectual persons about the court, asked to be invited to meet the professor the next time he should come. So he had to be invited again, and he was invited, and came, and was charming again. He could even play chess. "He's not out of the cellar," said the general. "He's quite a distinguished person." "There are many distinguished persons of that kind, and it's no fault of his." The professor, who was received in the king's palace, might very well be received by the general, but that he could ever belong to the house was out of the question. Only the whole town was talking of it. He grew and grew. The dew of favor fell from above, so no one was surprised after all that he should become a privy councillor, and Emily a privy councillor's lady. "Life is either a tragedy or a comedy," said the general. "In tragedies they die, in comedies they marry one another. In this case they married. And they had 3 clever boys, but not all at once. The sweet children rode on their hobby horses through all the rooms when they came to see the grandparents. And the general also rode on his stick. He rode behind them in the character of groom to the little privy councillors, and the general's lady sat on her sofa and smiled at them, even when she had her severest headache. So far did George get, and much further, else it had not been worthwhile to tell the story of the porter's son. Chapter 80. Poultry Meg's family. Poultry Meg was the only person who lived in the new stately dwelling that had been built for the fowls and ducks belonging to the manor house. It stood there where once the old knightly building had stood, with its tower, its pointed gables, its moat, and its drawbridge. Close by it was a wilderness of trees and thicket. Here the garden had been, and had stretched out to a great lake, which was now moorland. Crows and choughs flew screaming over the old trees, and there were crowds of birds. They did not seem to get fewer when any one shot among them, but seemed rather to increase. One heard the screaming into the poultry house, where Poultry Meg sat with the ducklings running to and fro over her wooden shoes. She knew every fowl and every duck from the moment it crept out of the shell, and she was fond of her fowls and her ducks, and proud of the stately house that had been built for them. Her own little room in the house was clean and neat, for that was the wish of the gracious lady to whom the house belonged. She often came in the company of grand noble guests, to whom she showed the hens and ducks barracks, as she called the little house. Here were a clothes cupboard, and an armchair, and even a chest of drawers, and on these drawers a polished metal plate had been placed, whereon was engraved the word Grubby, and this was the name of the noble family that had lived in the house of old. The brass plate had been found when they were digging the foundation, and the clerk had said it had no value except in being an old relic. The clerk knew all about the place, and about the old times, for he had his knowledge from books, and many a memorandum had been written and put in his table drawer. But the oldest of the crows perhaps knew more than he, and screamed it out in her own language, but that was the crow's language, and the clerk did not understand that, clever as he was. After the hot summer days the mist sometimes hung over the moorland as if a whole lake were behind the old trees, among which the crows and the daws were fluttering, and thus it had looked when the good knight Grubby had lived here when the old manor house stood with its thick red walls. The dog chain used to reach in those days quite over the gateway. Through the tower one went into a paved passage which led to the rooms. The windows were narrow, and the panes were small, even in the great hall where the dancing used to be, but in the time of the last Grubby, there had been no dancing in the hall within the memory of man, although an old drum still lay there that had served as part of the music. Here stood a quaintly carved cupboard, in which rare flower roots were kept, for my Lady Grubby was fond of plants and cultivated trees and shrubs. Her husband preferred riding out to shoot wolves and boars, and his little daughter Marie always went with him part of the way. When she was only 5 years old, she would sit proudly on her horse, and look saucily round with her great black eyes. It was a great amusement to her to hit out among the hunting dogs with her whip, but her father would rather have seen her hit among the peasant boys, who came running up to stare at their lord. The peasant in the clay hut close by the knightly house had a son named Sorin, of the same age as the gracious little lady. The boy could climb well, and had always to bring her down the birds' nests. The birds screamed as loud as they could, and one of the greatest of them hacked him with its beak over the eye so that the blood ran down, and it was at first thought the eye had been destroyed, but it had not been injured after all. Marie Grubby used to call him her Sorin, and that was a great favor, and was an advantage to Sorin's father poor John, who had one day committed a fault, and was to be punished by riding on the wooden horse. This same horse stood in the courtyard, and had 4 poles for legs, and a single narrow plant for a back. On this John had to ride astride, and some heavy bricks were fastened to his feet into the bargain, that he might not sit too comfortably. He made horrible grimaces, and Sorin wept and implored little Marie to interfere. She immediately ordered that Sorin's father should be taken down, and when they did not obey her, she stamped on the floor, and pulled at her father's sleeve till it was torn to pieces. She would have her way, and she got her way, and Sorin's father was taken down. Lady Grubby, who now came up, parted her little daughter's hair from the child's brow, and looked at her affectionately, but Marie did not understand why. She wanted to go to the hounds, and not to her mother, who went down into the garden, to the lake where the water lily bloomed, and the heads of bulrushes nodded amid the reeds, and she looked at all this beauty and freshness. "How pleasant," she said. In the garden stood at that time a rare tree, which she herself had planted. It was called the blood beech, a kind of negro growing among the other trees, so dark brown were the leaves. This tree required much sunshine, for in continual shade it would become bright green like the other trees, and thus lose its distinctive character. In the lofty chestnut trees were many birds' nests, and also in the thickets and in the grassy meadows. It seemed as though the birds knew that they were protected here, and that no one must fire a gun at them. Little Marie came here with Sorin. He knew how to climb, as we have already said, and eggs and fluffy feathered young birds were brought down. The birds, great and small, flew about in terror and tribulation. The peewit from the fields, and the crows and daws from the high trees, screamed and screamed. It was just such din as the family will raise to the present day. "What are you doing, you children?" cried the gentle lady. "That is sinful." Sorin stood abashed, and even the little gracious lady looked down a little, but then he said, quite short and pretty, "My father lets me do it." "Craw, craw." "Away, away from here," cried the great black birds, and they flew away, but on the following day they came back, for they were at home here. The quiet gentle lady did not remain long at home here on earth, for the good God called her away, and, indeed, her home was rather with him than in the knightly house, and the church bells tolled solemnly when her corpse was carried to the church, and the eyes of the poor people were wet with tears, for she had been good to them. When she was gone, no one attended to her plantations, and the garden ran to waste. Grubby the knight was a hard man, they said, but his daughter, young as she was, knew how to manage him. He used to laugh and let her have her way. She was now 12 years old, and strongly built. She looked the people through and through with her black eyes, rode her horse as bravely as a man, and could fire off her gun like a practiced hunter. One day there were great visitors in the neighborhood, the grandest visitors who could come. The young king, and his half-brother and comrade, the Lord Ulrich Frederick Gyldenlow. They wanted to hunt the wild boar, and to pass a few days at the castle of Grubby. Gyldenlow sat at table next to Marie Grubby, and he took her by the hand and gave her a kiss, as if she had been a relation, but she gave him a box on the ear, and told him she could not bear him, at which there was great laughter, as if that had been a very amusing thing. And perhaps it was very amusing, 5 years afterwards, when Marie had fulfilled her 17th year, a messenger arrived with a letter, in which Lord Gyldenlow proposed for the hand of the noble young lady. "There was a thing for you, he is the grandest and the most gallant gentleman in the whole country," said Grubby the knight. "That is not a thing to despise." "I don't care so very much about him," said Marie Grubby, but she did not despise the grandest man of all the country, who sat by the king's side. Silver plate, and fine linen and woolen, went off to Copenhagen in a ship, while the bride made the journey by land in 10 days. But the outfit met with contrary winds, or with no winds at all, for 4 months passed before it arrived, and when it came, my Lady Gyldenlow was gone. "I'd rather lie on coarse sacking than lie in his silken beds," she declared. "I'd rather walk barefoot than drive with him in a coach." Late one evening in November 2 women came riding into the town of Aarhus. They were the gracious Lady Gyldenlow, Marie Grubby, and her maid. They came from the town of Wee Isle, whither they had come in a ship from Copenhagen. They stopped at Lord Grubby's stone mansion in Aarhus. Grubby was not well pleased with this visit. Marie was accosted in hard words, but she had a bedroom given her, and got her beer soup of a morning. But the evil part of her father's nature was aroused against her, and she was not used to that. She was not of a gentle temper, and we often answer as we are addressed. She answered openly, and spoke with bitterness and hatred of her husband, with whom she declared she would not live. She was too honorable for that. A year went by, but it did not go by pleasantly. There were evil words between the father and the daughter, and that ought never to be. Bad words bear bad fruit. What could be the end of such a state of things? "We two cannot live under the same roof," said the father one day. "Go away from here to our old manor house. But you had better bite your tongue off than spread any lies among the people." And so the two parted. She went with her maid to the old castle where she had been born, and near which the gentle, pious lady, her mother, was lying in the church vault. An old cowherd lived in the courtyard, and was the only other inhabitant of the place. In the rooms heavy black cobwebs hung down, covered with dust. In the garden everything grew just as it would. Hops and climbing plants ran like a net between the trees and bushes, and the hemlock and nettle grew larger and stronger. The blood beech had been outgrown by other trees, and now stood in the shade, and its leaves were green like those of the common trees, and its glory had departed. Crows and choughs, in great close masses, flew past over the tall chestnut trees, and chattered and screamed as if they had something very important to tell one another, as if they were saying, "Now she's come back again, the little girl who had their eggs and their young ones stolen from them." And as for the thief who had got them down, he had to climb up a leafless tree, for he sat on a tall ship's mast, and was beaten with a rope's end if he did not behave himself. The clerk told all this in our own times. He had collected it and looked it up in books and memoranda. It was to be found, with many other writings, locked up in his table drawer. "Upward and downward is the course of the world," said he. It is strange to hear, and we will hear how it went with Marie Grubby. We need not for that forget Poultry Meg, who was sitting in her capital hen house, in our own time. Marie Grubby sat down in her times, but not with the same spirit that old Poultry Meg showed. The winter passed away, and the spring and the summer passed away, and the autumn came again, with the damp, cold sea fog. It was a lonely, desolate life in the old manor house. Marie Grubby took her gun in her hand and went out to the heath, and shot hares and foxes, and whatever birds she could hit. More than once she met the noble Sir Paldire, of Norroback, who was also wandering about with his gun and his dogs. He was tall and strong, and boasted of this when they talked together. He could have measured himself against the deceased Mr. Brockenhuis, of Ixcove, of whom the people still talked. Paldire had, after the example of Brockenhuis, caused an iron chain with a hunting horn to be hung in his gateway, and when he came riding home, he used to seize the chain, and lift himself and his horse from the ground, and blow the horn. "Come yourself, and see me do that, Dame Marie," he said. One can breathe fresh and free at Norroback. When she went to his castle is not known, but on the altar candlestick in the church of Norroback it was inscribed that they were the gift of Paldire and Marie Grubby, of Norroback Castle. A great stout man was Paldire. He drank like a sponge. He was like a tub that could never get full. He snored like a whole sty of pigs, and he looked red and bloated. "He is treacherous and malicious," said Dame Paldire, Grubby's daughter. Soon she was weary of her life with him, but that did not make it better. One day the table was spread, and the dishes grew cold. Paldire was out hunting foxes, and the gracious lady was nowhere to be found. Towards midnight Paldire came home, but Dame Dire came neither at midnight, nor next morning. She had turned her back upon Norroback, and had ridden away without saying goodbye. It was grey, wet weather. The wind grew cold, and a flight of black screaming birds flew over her head. They were not so homeless as she. First she journeyed southward, quite down into the German land. A couple of golden rings with costly stones were turned into money, and then she turned to the east, and then she turned again and went towards the west. She had no food before her eyes, and murmured against everything, even against the good God himself, so wretched was her soul. Soon her body became wretched too, and she was scarcely able to move a foot. The peewit flew up as she stumbled over the mound of earth where it had built its nest. The bird cried, as it always cried, "You thief! You thief!" She had never stolen her neighbor's goods, but as a little girl she had caused eggs and young birds to be taken from the trees, and she thought of that now. From where she lay she could see the sand dunes. By the seashore lived fishermen, but she could not get so far, she was so ill. The great white sea mews flew over her head, and screamed as the crows and daws screamed at home in the garden of the manor house. The birds flew quite close to her, and at last it seemed to her as if they became black as crows, and then all was night before her eyes. When she opened her eyes again, she was being lifted and carried. A great strong man had taken her up in his arms, and she was looking straight into his bearded face. He had a scar over one eye, which seemed to divide the eyebrow into two parts. Weak as she was, he carried her to the ship, where he got a rating for it from the captain. The next day the ship sailed away. Madame Grubby had not been put ashore, so she sailed away with it. But she will return, will she not? Yes, but where, and when? The clerk could tell about this too, and it was not a story which he patched together himself. He had the whole strange history out of an old authentic book, which we ourselves can take out and read. The Danish historian, Ludwig Holberg, who has written so many useful books and merry comedies, from which we can get such a good idea of his times and their people, tells in his letters of Marie Grubby, where and how he met her. It is well worth hearing. But for all that, we don't at all forget Poultry Meg, who was sitting cheerful and comfortable in the charming fowl house. The ship sailed away with Marie Grubby. That's where we left off. Long years went by. The plague was raging at Copenhagen. It was in the year 1711. The Queen of Denmark went away to her German home, the king quitted the capital, and everybody who could do so hurried away. The students, even those who had board and lodging gratis, left the city. One of these students, the last who had remained in the free college, at last went away too. It was 2 o'clock in the morning. He was carrying his knapsack, which was better stacked with books and writings than with clothes. A damp mist hung over the town, not a person was to be seen in the streets. The street doors around were marked with crosses, as a sign that the plague was within, or that all the inmates were dead. A great wagon rattled past him, the coachman brandished his whip, and the horses flew by at a gallop. The wagon was filled with corpses. The young student kept his hand before his face, and smelt at some strong spirits that he had with him on a sponge in a little brass scent case. Out of a small tavern in one of the streets there were sounds of singing and of unhallowed laughter, from people who drank the night through to forget that the plague was at their doors, and that they might be put into the wagon as the others had been. The student turned his steps towards the canal at the castle bridge, where a couple of small ships were lying. One of these was weighing anchor, to get away from the plague-stricken city. If God spares our lives and grants us a fair wind, we are going to Groenmud, near Falster, said the captain, and he asked the name of the student who wished to go with him. Ludwig Holberg, answered the student, and the name sounded like any other. But now there sounds in it one of the proudest names of Denmark. Then it was the name of a young, unknown student. The ship glided past the castle. It was not yet bright day when it was in the open sea. A light wind filled the sails, and the young student sat down with his face turned towards the fresh wind, and went to sleep, which was not exactly the most prudent thing he could have done. Already on the 3rd day the ship lay by the island of Falster. Do you know anyone here with whom I could lodge cheaply? Holberg asked the captain. I should think you would do well to go to the ferry woman in Borrehouse, answered the captain. If you want to be very civil to her, her name is Mother Sorensen Muller. But it may happen that she may fly into a fury if you are too polite to her. The man is in custody for a crime, and that's why she manages the ferryboat herself. She has fists of her own. The student took his knapsack and betook himself to the ferry house. The house door was not locked. It opened, and he went into a room with a brick floor, where a bench, with a great coverlet of leather, formed the chief article of furniture. A white hen, who had a brood of chickens, was fastened to the bench, and had overturned a pipkin of water, so that the wet ran across the floor. There were no people either here or in the adjoining room, only a cradle stood there, in which was a child. The ferryboat came back with only one person in it. Whether that person was a man or a woman was not an easy matter to determine. The person in question was wrapped in a great cloak, and wore a kind of hood. Presently the boat lay to. It was a woman who got out of it and came into the room. She looked very stately when she straightened her back. Two proud eyes looked forth from beneath her black eyebrows. It was Mother Sorin, the fairy wife. The crows and daws might have called out another name for her, which we know better. She looked morose, and did not seem to care to talk, but this much was settled, that the student should board in her house for an indefinite time, while things looked so bad in Copenhagen. This or that honest citizen would often come to the ferry house from the neighboring little town. There came Frank the cutler, and Savert the exciseman. They drank a mug of beer in the ferry house, and used to converse with the student, for he was a clever young man, who knew his practica, as they called it. He could read Greek and Latin, and was well up in learned subjects. The less one knows, the less it presses upon one, said Mother Sorin. You have to work hard, said Holberg one day, when she was dipping clothes in the strong soapy water, and was obliged herself to split the logs for the fire. That's my affair, she replied. Have you been obliged to toil in this way from your childhood? You can read that from my hands, she replied, and held out her hands, that were small indeed, but hard and strong, with bitten nails. You are learned, and can read. At Christmas time it began to snow heavily. The cold came on. The wind blew sharp, as if there were vitriol in it to wash the people's faces. Mother Sorin did not let that disturb her. She threw her cloak around her, and drew her hood over her head. Early in the afternoon it was already dark in the house. She laid wooden turf on the hearth, and then she sat down to darn her stockings, for there was no one to do it for her. Towards evening she spoke more words to the student than it was customary with her to use. She spoke of her husband. He killed a sailor of Draga by mischance, and for that he has to work for 3 years in irons. He's only a common sailor, and therefore the law must take its course. The law is there for people of high rank, too, said Holberg. Do you think so? Said Mother Sorin. Then she looked into the fire for a while, but after a time she began to speak again. Have you heard of Kylike, who caused a church to be pulled down, and when the clergyman, Master Martin, thundered from the pulpit about it, he had him put in irons, and sat in judgment upon him, and condemned him to death? Yes, and the clergyman was obliged to bow his head to the stroke. And yet Kylike went scot-free. He had a right to do as he did in those times, said Holberg, but now we have left those times behind us. You may get a fool to believe that, cried Mother Sorin, and she got up and went into the room where the child lay. She lifted up the child, and laid it down more comfortably. Then she arranged the bed-place of the student. He had the green coverlet, for he felt the cold more than she, though he was born in Norway. On New Year's morning it was a bright sunshiny day. The frost had been so strong, and was still so strong, that the fallen snow had become a hard mass, and one could walk upon it. The bells of the little town were tolling for church. Student Holberg wrapped himself up in his woolen cloak, and wanted to go to the town. Over the ferry house the crows and daws were flying with loud cries. One could hardly hear the church bells for their screaming. Mother Sorin stood in front of the house, filling a brass pot with snow, which she was going to put on the fire to get drinking water. She looked up to the crowd of birds, and thought her own thoughts. Student Holberg went to church. On his way there and on his return he passed by the house of tax collector Sivert, by the town gate. Here he was invited to take a mug of brown beer with treacle and sugar. The discourse fell upon Mother Sorin, but the tax collector did not know much about her, and, indeed, few knew much about her. She did not belong to the island of Fulster, he said. She had a little property of her own. At one time her husband was a common sailor, a fellow of a very hot temper, and had killed a sailor of Draga, and he beat his wife, and yet she defended him. I should not endure such treatment, said the tax collector's wife. I am come of more respectable people. My father was stocking weaver to the court, and consequently you have married a governmental official, said Holberg, and made a bow to her and to the collector. It was on 12th night, the evening of the festival of the Three Kings. Mother Sorin lit up for Holberg a 3-king candle, that is, a tallow candle with 3 wicks, which she had herself prepared. A light for each man, said Holberg. For each man? Repeated the woman, looking sharply at him. For each of the wise men from the east, said Holberg. You mean it that way, said she, and then she was silent for a long time. But on this evening he learned more about her than he had yet known. You speak very affectionately of your husband, observed Holberg, and yet the people say that he loses you every day. That's no one's business but mine, she replied. The blows might have done me good when I was a child. Now, I suppose, I get them for my sins. But I know what good he has done me, and she rose up. When I lay sick upon the desolate heath, and no one would have pity on me, and no one would have anything to do with me, except the crows and daws, which came to peck me to bits. He carried me in his arms, and had to bear hard words because of the burden he brought on board ship. It's not in my nature to be sick, and so I got well. Every man has his own way, and Soren has his, but the horse must not be judged by the halter. Taking one thing with another, I have lived more agreeably with him than with the man whom they called the most noble and gallant of the king's subjects. I have had the stadtholder Gyldenlo, the king's half-brother, for my husband, and afterwards I took Paldaya. One is as good as another, each in his own way, and I in mine. That was a long gossip, but now you know all about me," and with those words she left the room. It was Marie Grubby. So strangely had fate played with her. She did not live to see many anniversaries of the Festival of the Three Kings. Holberg has recorded that she died in June, 1716, but he has not written down, for he did not know, that a number of great black birds circled over the ferry house, when Mother Soren, as she was called, was lying there a corpse. They did not scream, as if they knew that at a burial silence should be observed. So soon as she lay in the earth, the birds disappeared, but on the same evening in Jutland, at the old manor house, an enormous number of crows and choughs were seen. They all cried as loud as they could, as if they had some announcement to make. Perhaps they talked of him who, as a little boy, had taken away their eggs and their young, of the peasant's son, who had to wear an iron garter, and of the noble young lady, who ended by being a ferryman's wife. Brave! Brave! They cried, and the whole family cried, brave! Brave! When the old house was pulled down, they are still crying, and yet there's nothing to cry about, said the clerk, when he told the story. The family is extinct, the house has been pulled down, and where it stood is now the stately poultry house, with gilded weathercocks, and the old poultry Meg. She rejoices greatly in her beautiful dwelling. If she had not come here, the old clerk added, she would have had to go into the workhouse. The pigeons cooed over her, the turkey cocks gobbled, and the ducks quacked. Nobody knew her. They said, she belongs to no family. It's pure charity that she is here at all. She has neither a drake father nor a hen mother, and has no descendants. She came of a great family, for all that, but she did not know it, and the old clerk did not know it, though he had so much written down, but one of the old crows knew about it, and told about it. She had heard from her own mother and grandmother about poultry Meg's mother and grandmother. And we know the grandmother too. We saw her ride, as child, over the bridge, looking proudly around her, as if the whole world belonged to her, and all the birds' nests in it, and we saw her on the heath, by the sand dunes, and, last of all, in the ferry house. The granddaughter, the last of the race, had come back to the old home, where the old castle had stood, where the black wild birds were screaming, but she sat among the tame birds, and these knew her and were fond of her. Poultry Meg had nothing left to wish for. She looked forward with pleasure to her death, and she was old enough to die. Grave, grave, cried the crows, and Poultry Meg has a good grave, which nobody knew except the old crow, if the old crow is not dead already. And now we know the story of the old manor house, of its old proprietors, and of all Poultry Meg's family. Chapter 81 Children's Prattle. At a rich merchant's house there was a children's party, and the children of rich and great people were there. The merchant was a learned man, for his father had sent him to college, and he had passed his examination. His father had been at first only a cattle dealer, but always honest and industrious, so that he had made money, and his son, the merchant, had managed to increase his store. Clever as he was, he had also a heart, but there was less said of his heart than of his money. All descriptions of people visited at the merchant's house, well-born, as well as intellectual, and some who possessed neither of these recommendations. Now it was a children's party, and there was children's prattle, which always is spoken freely from the heart. Among them was a beautiful little girl, who was terribly proud, but this had been taught her by the servants, and not by her parents, who were far too sensible people. Her father was groom of the chambers, which is a high office at court, and she knew it. I am a child of the court, she said. Now she might just as well have been a child of the cellar, for no one can help his birth, and then she told the other children that she was well born, and said that no one who was not well born could rise in the world. It was no use to read and be industrious, for if a person was not well born, he could never achieve anything. And those whose names end with sen, said she, can never be anything at all. We must put our arms akimbo, and make the elbow quite pointed, so as to keep these sen people at a great distance. And then she stuck out her pretty little arms, and made the elbows quite pointed, to show how it was to be done, and her little arms were very pretty, for she was a sweet-looking child. But the little daughter of the merchant became very angry at this speech, for her father's name was Peterson, and she knew that the name ended in sen, and therefore she said as proudly as she could, "But my papa can buy $100 worth of bonbons, and give them away to children." "Can your papa do that?" "Yes, and my papa," said the little daughter of the editor of a paper, "my papa can put your papa and everybody's papa into the newspaper. All sorts of people are afraid of him, my mama says, for he can do as he likes with the paper." And the little maiden looked exceedingly proud, as if she had been a real princess, who may be expected to look proud. But outside the door, which stood ajar, was a poor boy, peeping through the crack of the door. He was of such a lowly station that he had not been allowed even to enter the room. He had been turning the spit for the cook, and she had given him permission to stand behind the door and peep in at the well-dressed children, who were having such a merry time within, and for him that was a great deal. "Oh, if I could be one of them," thought he, and then he heard what was said about names, which was quite enough to make him more unhappy. His parents at home had not even a penny to spare to buy a newspaper, much less could they write in one, and worse than all, his father's name, and of course his own, ended in sen, and therefore he could never turn out well, which was a very sad thought. But after all, he had been born into the world, and the station of life had been chosen for him, therefore he must be content. And this is what happened on that evening. Many years passed, and most of the children became grown-up persons. There stood a splendid house in the town, filled with all kinds of beautiful and valuable objects. Everybody wished to see it, and people even came in from the country round to be permitted to view the treasures it contained. Which of the children whose prattle we have described, could call this house his own? One would suppose it very easy to guess. No, no, it is not so very easy. The house belonged to the poor little boy who had stood on that night behind the door. He had really become something great, although his name ended in sen, for it was Thorwaldsen. And the three other children, the children of good birth, of money, and of intellectual pride, well, they were respected and honored in the world, for they had been well provided for by birth and position, and they had no cause to reproach themselves with what they had thought and spoken on that evening long ago, for, after all, it was mere children's prattle. Chapter 82 The Princess and the Pea. Once upon a time there was a prince who wanted to marry a princess, but she would have to be a real princess. He traveled all over the world to find one, but nowhere could he get what he wanted. There were princesses enough, but it was difficult to find out whether they were real ones. There was always something about them that was not as it should be. So he came home again and was sad, for he would have liked very much to have a real princess. One evening a terrible storm came on, there was thunder and lightning, and the rain poured down in torrents. Suddenly a knocking was heard at the city gate, and the old king went to open it. It was a princess standing out there in front of the gate. But, good gracious! What a sight the rain and the wind had made her look! The water ran down from her hair and clothes, it ran down into the toes of her shoes and out again at the heels. And yet she said that she was a real princess. Well, we'll soon find that out, thought the old queen. But she said nothing, went into the bedroom, took all the bedding off the bedstead, and laid a pea on the bottom. Then she took 20 mattresses and laid them on the pea, and then 20 eider-down beds on top of the mattresses. On this the princess had to lie all night. In the morning she was asked how she had slept. "Oh, very badly," said she. "I have scarcely closed my eyes all night. Heaven only knows what was in the bed, but I was lying on something hard, so that I am black and blue all over my body. It's horrible." Now they knew that she was a real princess because she had felt the pea right through the 20 mattresses and the 20 eider-down beds. Nobody but a real princess could be as sensitive as that, so the prince took her for his wife, for now he knew that he had a real princess, and the pea was put in the museum, where it may still be seen, if no one has stolen it. There, that is a true story. Chapter 83 The Psyche. In the fresh morning dawn, in the rosy air gleams a great star, the brightest star of the morning. His rays tremble on the white wall, as if he wished to write down on it what he can tell, what he has seen there and elsewhere during thousands of years in our rolling world. Let us hear one of his stories. A short time ago. The star's short time ago is called among men centuries ago. My rays followed a young artist. It was in the city of the popes, in the world city, Rome. Much has been changed there in the course of time, but the changes have not come so quickly as the change from youth to old age. Then already the palace of the Caesars was a ruin, as it is now. Fig trees and laurels grew among the fallen marble columns, and in the desolate bathing halls, where the gilding still clings to the wall, the Colosseum was a gigantic ruin. The church bells sounded, the incense sent up its fragrant cloud, and through the streets marched processions with flaming tapers and glowing canopies. Holy Church was there, and art was held as a high and holy thing. In Rome lived the greatest painter in the world, Raphael. There also dwelt the first of sculptors, Michelangelo. Even the Pope paid homage to these two, and honored them with a visit. Art was recognized and honored, and was rewarded also. But, for all that, everything great and splendid was not seen and known. In a narrow lane stood an old house. Once it had been a temple. A young sculptor now dwelt there. He was young and quite unknown. He certainly had friends, young artists, like himself, young in spirit, young in hopes and thoughts. They told him he was rich in talent, and an artist, but that he was foolish for having no faith in his own power, for he always broke what he had fashioned out of clay, and never completed anything, and a work must be completed if it is to be seen and to bring money. You are a dreamer, they went on to say to him, and that's your misfortune. But the reason of this is, that you have never lived, you have never tasted life, you have never enjoyed it in great wholesome draughts, as it ought to be enjoyed. In youth one must mingle one's own personality with life, that they may become one. Look at the great master Raphael, whom the Pope honors and the world admires. He's no despiser of wine and bread, and he even appreciates the baker's daughter. The pretty Fornerina, added Angelo, one of the merriest of the young friends. Yes, they said a good many things of the kind, according to their age and their reason. They wanted to draw the young artist out with them into the merry wild life, the mad life as it might also be called, and at certain times he felt an inclination for it. He had a warm blood, a strong imagination, and could take part in the merry chat, and laugh aloud with the rest, but what they called Raphael's merry life disappeared before him like a vapor when he saw the divine radiance that beamed forth from the pictures of the great master, and when he stood in the Vatican, before the forms of beauty which the masters had hewn out of marble thousands of years since. His breast swelled, and he felt within himself something high, something holy, something elevating, great and good, and he wished that he could produce similar forms from the blocks of marble. He wished to make a picture of that which was within him, stirring upward from his heart to the realms of the infinite, but how, and in what form? The soft clay was fashioned under his fingers into forms of beauty, but the next day he broke what he had fashioned, according to his wont. One day he walked past one of those rich palaces of which Rome has many to show. He stopped before the great open portal, and beheld a garden surrounded by cloistered walks. The garden bloomed with a goodly show of the fairest roses. Great white lilies with green juicy leaves shot upward from the marble basin in which the clear water was splashing, and a form glided past, the daughter of the princely house, graceful, delicate, and wonderfully fair. Such a form of female loveliness he had never before beheld, yet stay, he had seen it, painted by Raphael, painted as a Psyche, in one of the Roman palaces. Yes, there it had been painted, but here it passed by him in living reality. The remembrance lived in his thoughts, in his heart. He went home to his humble room, and modeled a Psyche of clay. It was the rich young Roman girl, the noble maiden, and for the first time he looked at his work with satisfaction. It had a meaning for him, for it was she. And the friends who saw his work shouted aloud for joy. They declared that this work was a manifestation of his artistic power, of which they had long been aware, and that now the world should be made aware of it too. The clay figure was lifelike and beautiful, but it had not the whiteness or the durability of marble. So they declared that the Psyche must henceforth live in marble. He already possessed a costly block of that stone. It had been lying for years, the property of his parents, in the courtyard. Fragments of glass, climbing weeds, and remains of artichokes had gathered about it and sullied its purity, but under the surface the block was as white as the mountain snow, and from this block the Psyche was to arise. Now, it happened one morning. The bright star tells nothing about this, but we know it occurred that a noble Roman company came into the narrow lane. The carriage stopped at the top of the lane, and the company proceeded on foot towards the house, to inspect the young sculptor's work, for they had heard him spoken of by chance. And who were these distinguished guests? Poor young man. Or fortunate young man he might be called. The noble young lady stood in the room and smiled radiantly when her father said to her, "It is your living image." That smile could not be copied, any more than the look could be reproduced, the wonderful look which she cast upon the young artist. It was a fiery look, that seemed at once to elevate and to crush him. The Psyche must be executed in marble, said the wealthy patrician. And those were words of life for the dead clay and the heavy block of marble, and words of life likewise for the deeply moved artist. "When the work is finished I will purchase it," continued the rich noble. A new era seemed to have arisen in the poor studio. Life and cheerfulness gleamed there, and busy industry plied its work. The beaming morning star beheld how the work progressed. The clay itself seemed inspired since she had been there, and molded itself, in heightened beauty, to a likeness of the well-known features. "Now I know what life is," cried the artist rejoicingly. "It is love. It is the lofty abandonment of self for the dawning of the beautiful in the soul. What my friends call life and enjoyment is a passing shadow. It is like bubbles among seething dregs, not the pure heavenly wine that consecrates us to life." The marble block was reared in its place. The chisel struck great fragments from it. The measurements were taken, points and lines were made, the mechanical part was executed, till gradually the stone assumed a human female form, a shape of beauty, and became converted into the Psyche, fair and glorious, a divine being in human shape. The heavy stone appeared as a gliding, dancing, airy Psyche, with a heavenly innocent smile, the smile that had mirrored itself in the soul of the young artist. The star of the roseate dawn beheld and understood what was stirring within the young man, and could read the meaning of the changing color of his cheek, of the light that flashed from his eye, as he stood busily working, reproducing what had been put into his soul from above. "Thou art a master like those masters among the ancient Greeks," exclaimed his delighted friends. "Soon shall the whole world admire thy Psyche, my Psyche." He repeated, "Yes, mine. She must be mine. I, too, am an artist, like those great men who are gone. Providence has granted me the boon, and has made me the equal of that lady of noble birth." And he knelt down and breathed a prayer of thankfulness to heaven, and then he forgot heaven for her sake, for the sake of her picture in stone, for her Psyche which stood there as if formed of snow, blushing in the morning dawn. He was to see her in reality, the living, graceful Psyche, whose words sounded like music in his ears. He could now carry the news into the rich palace that the marble Psyche was finished. He betook himself thither, strode through the open courtyard where the waters ran splashing from the dolphins' jaws into the marble basins, where the snowy lilies and the fresh roses bloomed in abundance. He stepped into the great lofty hall, whose walls and ceilings shone with gilding and bright colors and heraldic devices. Gaily dressed serving men, adorned with trappings like sleigh horses, walked to and fro, and some reclined at their ease upon the carved oak seats, as if they were the masters of the house. He told them what had brought him to the palace, and was conducted up the shining marble staircase, covered with soft carpets and adorned with many a statue. Then he went on through richly furnished chambers, over mosaic floors, amid gorgeous pictures. All this pomp and luxury seemed to weary him, but soon he felt relieved, for the princely old master of the house received him most graciously, almost heartily, and when he took his leave he was requested to step into the signora's apartment, for she, too, wished to see him. The servants led him through more luxurious halls and chambers into the room, where she appeared the chief and leading ornament. She spoke to him. No hymn of supplication, no holy chant, could melt his soul like the sound of her voice. He took her hand and lifted it to his lips. No rose was softer, but a fire thrilled through him from this rose. A feeling of power came upon him, and words poured from his tongue. He knew not what he said. Does the crater of the volcano know that the glowing lava is pouring from it? He confessed what he felt for her. She stood before him astonished, offended, proud, with contempt in her face, an expression of disgust, as if she had suddenly touched a cold unclean reptile. Her cheeks reddened, her lips grew white, and her eyes flashed fire, though they were dark as the blackness of night. "Madman!" she cried, "away! Begone!" and she turned her back upon him. Her beautiful face wore an expression like that of the stony countenance with the snaky locks. Like a stricken, fainting man, he tottered down the staircase and out into the street. Like a man walking in his sleep, he found his way back to his dwelling. Then he woke up to madness and agony, and seized his hammer, swung it high in the air, and rushed forward to shatter the beautiful marble image. But, in his pain, he had not noticed that his friend Angelo stood beside him, and Angelo held back his arm with a strong grasp, crying, "Are you mad? What are you about?" They struggled together. Angelo was the stronger, and, with a deep sigh of exhaustion, the young artist threw himself into a chair. "What has happened?" asked Angelo. "Command yourself. Speak." But what could he say? How could he explain? And as Angelo could make no sense of his friend's incoherent words, he forbore to question him further, and merely said, "Your blood grows thick from your eternal dreaming. Be a man, as all others are, and don't go on living in ideals, for that is what drives men crazy. A jovial feast will make you sleep quietly and happily. Believe me, the time will come when you will be old, and your sinews will shrink, and then, on some fine sunshiny day, when everything is laughing and rejoicing, you will lie there a faded plant, that will grow no more. I do not live in dreams, but in reality. Come with me. Be a man. And he drew the artist away with him. At this moment he was able to do so, for a fire ran in the blood of the young sculptor. A change had taken place in his soul. He felt a longing to tear from the old, the accustomed to forget, if possible, his own individuality, and therefore it was that he followed Angelo. In an out-of-the-way suburb of Rome lay a tavern much visited by artists. It was built on the ruins of some ancient baths. The great yellow citrons hung down among the dark shining leaves, and covered a part of the old reddish-yellow walls. The tavern consisted of a vaulted chamber, almost like a cavern, in the ruins. A lamp burned there before the picture of the Madonna. A great fire gleamed on the hearth, and roasting and boiling was going on there. Without, under the citron trees and laurels, stood a few covered tables. The two artists were received by their friends with shouts of welcome. Little was eaten, but much was drunk, and the spirits of the company rose. Songs were sung and ditties were played on the guitar. Presently the salterillo sounded, and the merry dance began. Two young Roman girls, who sat as models to the artists, took part in the dance and in the festivity. Two charming pageanters were they, certainly not Psyches, not delicate, beautiful roses, but fresh, hearty, glowing carnations. How hot it was on that day! Even after sundown it was hot. There was fire in the blood, fire in every glance, fire everywhere. The air gleamed with gold and roses, and life seemed like gold and roses. At last you have joined us, for once, said his friends. Now let yourself be carried by the waves within and around you. Never yet have I felt so well, so merry, cried the young artist. You are right, you are all of you right. I was a fool, a dreamer. Man belongs to reality, and not to fancy. With songs and with sounding guitars the young people returned that evening from the tavern, through the narrow streets. The two glowing carnations, daughters of the Campagna, went with them. In Angelo's room, among a litter of colored sketches, studies, and glowing pictures, the voices sounded mellower, but not less merrily. On the ground lay many a sketch that resembled the daughters of the Campagna, in their fresh, hearty comeliness, but the two originals were far handsomer than their portraits. All the burners of the six-armed lamp flared and flamed, and the human flamed up from within, and appeared in the glare as if it were divine. Apollo, Jupiter, I feel myself raised to a heaven to your glory. I feel as if the blossom of life were unfolding itself in my veins at this moment. Yes, the blossom unfolded itself, and then burst and fell, and an evil vapor rose from it, blinding the sight, leading astray the fancy. The firework of the senses went out, and it became dark. He was again in his own room. There he sat down on his bed and collected his thoughts. Fie on thee. These were the words that sounded out of his mouth from the depths of his heart. Wretched man, go, begone. And a deep painful sigh burst from his bosom. Away. Begone. These, her words, the words of the living Psyche, echoed through his heart, escaped from his lips. He buried his head in the pillows, his thoughts grew confused, and he fell asleep. In the morning dawn he started up, and collected his thoughts anew. What had happened? Had all the past been a dream? The visit to her, the feast at the tavern, the evening with the purple carnations of the Campagna? No, it was all really a reality he had never before experienced. In the purple air gleamed the bright star, and its beams fell upon him and upon the marble Psyche. He trembled as he looked at that picture of immortality, and his glance seemed impure to him. He threw the cloth over the statue, and then touched it once more to unveil the form, but he was not able to look again at his own work. Gloomy, quiet, absorbed in his own thoughts, he sat there through the long day. He heard nothing of what was going on around him, and no man guessed what was passing in this human soul. And days and weeks went by, but the nights passed more slowly than the days. The flashing star beheld him one morning as he rose, pale and trembling with fever, from his sad couch. Then he stepped towards the statue, threw back the covering, took one long, sorrowful gaze at his work, and then, almost sinking beneath the burden, he dragged the statue out into the garden. In that place was an old dry well, now nothing but a hole. Into this he cast the Psyche, threw earth in above her, and covered up the spot with twigs and nettles. Away. Begone. Such was the short epitaph he spoke. The star beheld all this from the pink morning sky, and its beam trembled upon two great tears upon the pale feverish cheeks of the young man, and soon it was said that he was sick unto death, and he lay stretched upon a bed of pain. The convent brother Ignatius visited him as a physician and a friend, and brought him words of comfort, of religion, and spoke to him of the peace and happiness of the church, of the sinfulness of man, of rest and mercy to be found in heaven, and the words fell like warm sunbeams upon a teeming soil. The soil smoked and sent up clouds of mist, fantastic pictures pictures in which there was reality, and from these floating islands he looked across at human life. He found it vanity and delusion, and vanity and delusion it had been to him. They told him that art was a sorcerer, betraying us to vanity and to earthly lusts, that we are false to ourselves, unfaithful to our friends, unfaithful towards heaven, and that the serpent was always repeating within us, "Eat, and thou shalt become as God," and it appeared to him as if now, for the first time, he knew himself, and had found the way that leads to truth and to peace. In the church was the light and the brightness of God. In the monk's cell he should find the rest through which the tree of human life might grow on into eternity. Brother Ignatius strengthened his longings, and the determination became firm within him. A child of the world became a servant of the church. The young artist renounced the world, and retired into the cloister. The brothers came forward affectionately to welcome him, and his inauguration was as a Sunday feast. Heaven seemed to him to dwell in the sunshine of the church, and to beam upon him from the holy pictures and from the cross. And when, in the evening, at the sunset hour, he stood in his little cell, and, opening the windows, looked out upon old Rome, upon the desolated temples, and the great dead Colosseum, when he saw all this in its spring garb, when the acacias bloomed, and the ivy was fresh, and roses burst forth everywhere, and the citron and orange were in the height of their beauty, and the palm trees waved their branches, then he felt a deeper emotion than had ever yet thrilled through him. The quiet open Campagna spread itself forth towards the blue snow-covered mountains, which seemed to be painted in the air, all the outlines melting into each other, breathing peace and beauty, floating, dreaming, and all appearing like a dream. Yes, this world was a dream, and the dream lasts for hours, and may return for hours, but convent life is a life of years, long years, and many years. From within comes much that renders men sinful and impure. He fully realized the truth of this. What flames arose up in him at times! What a source of evil, of that which we would not, welled up continually. He mortified his body, but the evil came from within. One day, after the lapse of many years, he met Angelo, who recognized him. "Man!" exclaimed Angelo. "Yes, it is thou. Art thou happy now? Thou hast sinned against God, and cast away his boon from thee, hast neglected thy mission in this world. Read the parable of the entrusted talent. The master, who spoke that parable, spoke the truth. What hast thou gained? What hast thou found? Dost thou not fashion for thyself a religion and a dreamy life after thine own idea, as almost all do? Suppose all this is a dream, a fair delusion, get thee away from me, Satan," said the monk, and he quitted Angelo. "There is a devil, a personal devil. This day I have seen him," said the monk to himself. "Once I extended a finger to him, and he took my whole hand. But now," he sighed, "the evil is within me, and it is in yonder man, but it does not bow him down. He goes abroad with head erect, and enjoys his comfort, and I grasped at comfort in the consolations of religion. If it were nothing but a consolation, supposing everything here were, like the world I have quitted, only a beautiful fancy, a delusion like the beauty of the evening clouds, like the misty blue of the distant hills! When you approach them, they are very different. O eternity! Thou actest like the great calm ocean, that beckons us, and fills us with expectation, and when we embark upon thee, we sink, disappear, and cease to be. Delusion! Away with it! Begone!" And tearless, but sunk in bitter reflection, he sat upon his hard couch, and then knelt down before whom? Before the stone cross fastened to the wall? No, it was only habit that made him take this position. The more deeply he looked into his own heart, the blacker did the darkness seem. Nothing within, nothing without, this life squandered and cast away. And this thought rolled and grew like a snowball, until it seemed to crush him. "I can confide my griefs to none. I may speak to none of the gnawing worm within. My secret is my prisoner. If I let the captive escape, I shall be his." And the godlike power that dwelt within him suffered and strove. "O Lord, my Lord," he cried, in his despair, "be merciful and grant me faith. I threw away the gift thou hadst vouchsafed to me. I left my mission unfulfilled. I lacked strength, and strength thou didst not give me. Immortality, the psyche in my breast, away with it! It shall be buried like that psyche, the best gleam of my life, never will it arise out of its grave. The star glowed in the roseate air, the star that shall surely be extinguished and pass away while the soul still lives on. Its trembling beam fell upon the white wall, but it wrote nothing thereupon, being made perfect in God, nothing of the hope of mercy, of the reliance on the divine love that thrills through the heart of the believer. The psyche within can never die. Shall it live in consciousness? Can the incomprehensible happen? Yes, yes. My being is incomprehensible. Thou art unfathomable, O Lord. Thy whole world is incomprehensible, a wonderwork of power, of glory and of love. His eyes gleamed, and then closed in death. The tolling of the church bell was the last sound that echoed above him, above the dead man, and they buried him, covering him with earth that had been brought from Jerusalem, and in which was mingled the dust of many of the pious dead. When years had gone by, his skeleton was dug up, as the skeletons of the monks who had died before him had been. It was clad in a brown frock, a rosary was put into the bony hand, and the form was placed among the ranks of other skeletons in the cloisters of the convent. And the sun shone without, while within the censers were waved and a mass was celebrated, and years rolled by. The bones fell asunder and became mingled with others. Skulls were piled up till they formed an outer wall around the church, and there lay also his head in the burning sun, for many dead were there, and no one knew their names, and his name was forgotten also. And see, something was moving in the sunshine, in the sightless cavernous eyes. What might that be? A sparkling lizard moved about in the skull, gliding in and out through the sightless holes. The lizard now represented all the life left in that head, in which once great thoughts, bright dreams, the love of art and of the glorious, had arisen, whence hot tears had rolled down, where hope and immortality had had their being. The lizard sprang away and disappeared, and the skull itself crumbled to pieces and became dust among dust. Centuries passed away. The bright star gleamed unaltered, radiant and large, as it had gleamed for thousands of years, and the air glowed red with tints fresh as roses, crimson like blood. There, where once had stood the narrow lane containing the ruins of the temple, a nunnery was now built. A grave was being dug in the convent garden for a young nun who had died, and was to be laid in the earth this morning. The spade struck against a hard substance. It was a stone, that shone dazzling white. A block of marble soon appeared, a rounded shoulder was laid bare, and now the spade was plied with a more careful hand, and presently a female head was seen, and butterflies' wings. Out of the grave in which the young nun was to be laid they lifted, in the rosy morning, a wonderful statue of a Psyche carved in white marble. How beautiful, how perfect it is! Cried the spectators. A relic of the best period of art. And who could the sculptor have been? No one knew, no one remembered him, except the bright star that had gleamed for thousands of years. The star had seen the course of that life on earth, and knew of the man's trials, of his weakness in fact, that he had been but human. The man's life had passed away. His dust had been scattered abroad as dust is destined to be, but the result of his noblest striving, the glorious work that gave token of the divine element within him, their Psyche that never dies, that lives beyond posterity, the brightness even of this earthly Psyche remained here after him, and was seen and acknowledged and appreciated. The bright morning star in the roseate air threw its glancing ray downward upon the Psyche, and upon the radiant countenances of the admiring spectators, who here beheld the image of the soul portrayed in marble. What is earthly will pass away and be forgotten, and the star in the vast firmament knows it. What is heavenly will shine brightly through posterity, and when the ages of posterity are past, the Psyche, the soul, will still live on. Chapter 84. The Puppet Show Man. On board a steamer I once met an elderly man, with such a merry face that, if it was really an index of his mind, he must have been the happiest fellow in creation, and indeed he considered himself so, for I heard it from his own mouth. He was a Dane, the owner of a travelling theatre. He had all his company with him in a large box, for he was the proprietor of a puppet show. His inborn cheerfulness, he said, had been tested by a member of the Polytechnic institution, and the experiment had made him completely happy. I did not at first understand all this, but afterwards he explained the whole story to me, and here it is: I was giving a representation, he said, in the hall of the posting house in the little town of Slagels. There was a splendid audience, entirely juvenile excepting two respectable matrons. All at once, a person in black, of student-like appearance, entered the room, and sat down. He laughed aloud at the telling points, and applauded quite at the proper time. This was a very unusual spectator for me, and I felt anxious to know who he was. I heard that he was a member of the Polytechnic institution in Copenhagen, who had been sent out to lecture to the people in the provinces. Punctually at 8 o'clock my performance closed, for children must go early to bed, and a manager must also consult the convenience of the public. At 9 o'clock the lecturer commenced his lecture and his experiments, and then I formed a part of his audience. It was wonderful both to hear and to see. The greater part of it was beyond my comprehension, but it led me to think that if we men can acquire so much, we must surely be intended to last longer than the little span which extends only to the time when we are hidden away under the earth. His experiments were quite miracles on a small scale, and yet the explanations flowed as naturally as water from his lips. At the time of Moses and the prophets, such a man would have been placed among the sages of the land. In the Middle Ages they would have burned him at the stake. All night long I could not sleep, and the next evening when I gave another performance and the lecturer was present, I was in one of my best moods. I once heard of an actor, who, when he had to act the part of a lover, always thought of one particular lady in the audience. He only played for her, and forgot all the rest of the house, and now the Polytechnic lecturer was my only auditor, for whom alone I played. When the performance was over, and the puppets removed behind the curtain, the Polytechnic lecturer invited me into his room to take a glass of wine. He talked of my comedies, and I of his science, and I believe we were both equally pleased. But I had the best of it, for there was much in what he did that he could not always explain to me. For instance, why a piece of iron which is rubbed on a cylinder, should become magnetic. How does this happen? The magnetic sparks come to it, but how? It is the same with people in the world. They are rubbed about on this spherical globe till the electric spark comes upon them, and then we have a Napoleon, or a Luther, or some one of the kind. The whole world is but a series of miracles, said the lecturer. But we are so accustomed to them that we call them everyday matters. And he went on explaining things to me till my skull seemed lifted from my brain, and I declared that were I not such an old fellow, I would at once become a member of the Polytechnic institution, that I might learn to look at the bright side of everything, although I was one of the happiest of men, one of the happiest, said the lecturer, as if the idea pleased him. Are you really happy? Yes, I replied, for I am welcomed in every town, when I arrive with my company, but I certainly have one wish which sometimes weighs upon my cheerful temper like a mountain of lead. I should like to become the manager of a real theatre, and the director of a real troupe of men and women. I understand, he said, you would like to have life breathed into your puppets, so that they might be living actors, and you their director. And would you then be quite happy? I said I believed so. But he did not, and we talked it over in all manner of ways, yet could not agree on the subject. However, the wine was excellent, and we clanked our glasses together as we drank. There must have been magic in it, or I should most certainly become tipsy, but that did not happen, for my mind seemed quite clear, and, indeed, a kind of sunshine filled the room, and beamed from the eyes of the Polytechnic lecturer. It made me think of the old stories when the gods, in their immortal youth, wandered upon this earth, and paid visits to mankind. I said so to him, and he smiled, and I could have sworn that he was one of these ancient deities in disguise, or, at all events, that he belonged to the race of the gods. The result seemed to prove I was right in my suspicions, for it was arranged that my highest wish should be granted, that my puppets were to be gifted with life, and that I was to be the manager of a real company. We drank to my success, and clanked our glasses. Then he packed all my dolls into the box, and fastened it on my back, and I felt as if I were spinning round in a circle, and presently found myself lying on the floor. I remember that quite well. And then the whole company sprang from the box. The spirit had come upon us all. The puppets had become distinguished actors at least, so they said themselves, and I was their director. When all was ready for the first representation, the whole company requested permission to speak to me before appearing in public. The dancing lady said the house could not be supported unless she stood on one leg, for she was a great genius, and begged to be treated as such. The lady who acted the part of a queen expected to be treated as a queen off the stage, as well as on it, or else she said she should get out of practice. The man whose duty it was to deliver a letter gave himself as many airs as he who took the part of first lover in the piece. He declared that the inferior parts were as important as the great ones, and deserving equal consideration, as parts of an artistic whole. The hero of the piece would only play in a part containing points likely to bring down the applause of the house. The prima donna would only act when the lights were red, for she declared that a blue light did not suit her complexion. It was like a company of flies in a bottle, and I was in the bottle with them, for I was their director. My breath was taken away, my head whirled, and I was as miserable as a man could be. It was quite a novel, strange set of beings among whom I now found myself. I only wished I had them all in my books again, and that I had never been their director. So I told them roundly that, after all, they were nothing but puppets, and then they killed me. After a while I found myself lying on my bed in my room, but how I got there, or how I got away at all from the Polytechnic professor, you may perhaps know. I don't. The moon shone upon the floor, the box lay open, and the dolls were all scattered about in great confusion, but I was not idle. I jumped off the bed, and into the box they all had to go, some on their heads, some on their feet. Then I shut down the lid, and seated myself upon the box. Now you all have to stay, said I, and I shall be cautious how I wish you flesh and blood again. I felt quite light, my cheerfulness had returned, and I was the happiest of mortals. The Polytechnic professor had fully cured me. I was as happy as a king, and went to sleep on the box. Next morning, correctly speaking, it was noon, for I slept remarkably late the day. I found myself still sitting there, in happy consciousness that my former wish had been a foolish one. I inquired for the Polytechnic professor, but he had disappeared like the Greek and Roman gods. From that time I have been the happiest man in the world. I'm a happy director, for none of my company ever grumble, nor the public either, for I always make them merry. I can arrange my pieces just as I please. I choose out of every comedy what I like best, and no one is offended. Plays that are neglected nowadays by the great public were ran after 30 years ago, and listened to till the tears ran down the cheeks of the audience. These are the pieces I bring forward. I place them before the little ones, who cry over them as Papa and Mama used to cry 30 years ago. But I make them shorter, for the youngsters don't like long speeches, and if they have anything mournful, they like it to be over quickly. Chapter 85. The races. A prize, or rather two prizes, a great one and a small one, had been awarded for the greatest swiftness in running, not in a single race, but for the whole year. I obtained the first prize, said the hare. Justice must still be carried out, even when one has relations and good friends among the prize committee, but that the snail should have received the second prize, I consider almost an insult to myself. No, said the fence rail, who had been a witness at the distribution of prizes, there should be some consideration for industry and perseverance. I have heard many respectable people say so, and I can quite understand it. The snail certainly took half a year to get over the threshold of the door, but he injured himself, and broke his collarbone by the haste he made. He gave himself entirely to the race, and ran with his house on his back, which was all, of course, very praiseworthy, and therefore he obtained the second prize. I think I ought to have had some consideration too, said the swallow. I should imagine no one can be swifter in soaring and flight than I am, and how far I have been. Far, far away. Yes, that is your misfortune, said the fence rail. You are so fickle, so unsettled, you must always be traveling about into foreign lands when the cold commences here. You have no love of fatherland in you. There can be no consideration for you, but now, if I have been lying the whole winter in the moor, said the swallow, and suppose I slept the whole time, would that be taken into account? Bring a certificate from the old moorhen, said he, that you have slept away half your time in fatherland, then you will be treated with some consideration. I deserved the first prize, and not the second, said the snail. I know so much, at least, that the hare only ran from cowardice, and because he thought there was danger in delay. I, on the other hand, made running the business of my life, and have become a cripple in the service. If anyone had a first prize, it ought to have been myself. But I do not understand chattering and boasting, on the contrary, I despise it. And the snail spat at them with contempt. I am able to affirm with word of oath, that each prize at least, those for which I voted, was given with just and proper consideration, said the old boundary post in the wood, who was a member of the committee of judges. I always act with due order, consideration, and calculation. 7 times have I already had the honor to be present at the distribution of the prizes, and to vote, but today is the first time I have been able to carry out my will. I always reckoned the first prize by going through the alphabet from the beginning, and a second by going through from the end. Be so kind as to give me your attention, and I will explain to you how I reckon from the beginning. The 8th letter from A is H, and there we have H for hare, therefore I awarded to the hare the first prize. The 8th letter from the end of the alphabet is S, and therefore the snail received the second prize. Next year, the letter I will have its turn for the first prize, and the letter R for the second. I should really have voted for myself, said the mule, if I had not been one of the judges on the committee. Not only the rapidity with which advance is made, but every other quality should have due consideration, as, for instance, how much weight a candidate is able to draw, but I have not brought this quality forward now, nor the sagacity of the hare in his flight, nor the cunning with which he suddenly springs aside and doubles, to lead people on a false track, thinking he has concealed himself. No, there is something else on which more stress should be laid, and which ought not be left unnoticed. I mean that which mankind call the beautiful. It is on the beautiful that I particularly fix my eyes. I observed the well-grown ears of the hare. It is a pleasure to me to observe how long they are. It seemed as if I saw myself again in the days of my childhood, and so I voted for the hare. Buse, said the fly. There, I'm not going to make a long speech, but I wish to say something about hares. I have really overtaken more than one hare, when I have been seated on the engine in front of a railway train. I often do so. One can then so easily judge of one's own swiftness. Not long ago, I crushed the hind legs of a young hare. He had been running a long time before the engine. He had no idea that I was traveling there. At last he had to stop in his career, and the engine ran over his hind legs, and crushed them, for I set upon it. I left him lying there, and rode on farther. I call that conquering him, but I do not want the prize. It really seems to me, thought the wild rose, though she did not express her opinion aloud, it is not in her nature to do so, though it would have been quite as well if she had. It certainly seems to me that the sunbeam ought to have had the honor of receiving the first prize. The sunbeam flies in a few minutes along the immeasurable path from the sun to us. It arrives in such strength, that all nature awakes to loveliness and beauty. We roses blush and exhale fragrance in its presence. Our worshipful judges don't appear to have noticed this at all. Were I the sunbeam, I would give each one of them a sunstroke, but that would only make them mad, and they are mad enough already. I only hope, continued the rose, that peace may reign in the wood. It is glorious to bloom, to be fragrant, and to live in story and in song. The sunbeam will outlive us all. What is the first prize? Asked the earthworm, who had overslept the time, and only now came up. It contains a free admission to a cabbage garden, replied the mule. I propose that as one of the prizes. The hare most decidedly must have it, and I, as an active and thoughtful member of the committee, took especial care that the prize should be one of advantage to him, so now he is provided for. The snail can now sit on the fence, and lick up moss and sunshine. He has also been appointed one of the first judges of swiftness in racing. It is worth much to know that one of the numbers is a man of talent in the thing men call a committee. I must say I expect much in the future. We have already made such a good beginning. Chapter 86 The Red Shoes. Once upon a time there was a little girl, pretty and dainty. But in summer time she was obliged to go barefooted because she was poor, and in winter she had to wear large wooden shoes, so that her little instep grew quite red. In the middle of the village lived an old shoemaker's wife. She sat down and made, as well as she could, a pair of little shoes out of some old pieces of red cloth. They were clumsy, but she meant well, for they were intended for the little girl, whose name was Karen. Karen received the shoes and wore them for the first time on the day of her mother's funeral. They were certainly not suitable for mourning, but she had no others, and so she put her bare feet into them and walked behind the humble coffin. Just then a large old carriage came by, and in it sat an old lady. She looked at the little girl, and taking pity on her, said to the clergyman, "Look here, if you will give me the little girl, I will take care of her." Karen believed that this was all on account of the red shoes, but the old lady thought them hideous, and so they were burnt. Karen herself was dressed very neatly and cleanly. She was taught to read and to sew, and people said that she was pretty. But the mirror told her, "You are more than pretty, you are beautiful." One day the queen was traveling through that part of the country, and had her little daughter, who was a princess, with her. All the people, amongst them Karen too, streamed towards the castle, where the little princess, in fine white clothes, stood before the window and allowed herself to be stared at. She wore neither a train nor a golden crown, but beautiful red morocco shoes. They were indeed much finer than those which the shoemaker's wife had sewn for little Karen. There is really nothing in the world that can be compared to red shoes. Karen was now old enough to be confirmed. She received some new clothes, and she was also to have some new shoes. The rich shoemaker in the town took the measure of her little foot in his own room, in which there stood great glass cases full of pretty shoes and white slippers. It all looked very lovely, but the old lady could not see very well, and therefore did not get much pleasure out of it. Amongst the shoes stood a pair of red ones, like those which the princess had worn. How beautiful they were! And the shoemaker said that they had been made for a count's daughter, but that they had not fitted her. "I suppose they are of shiny leather?" asked the old lady. "They shine so." "Yes, they do shine," said Karen. "They fitted her, and were bought." But the old lady knew nothing of their being red, for she would never have allowed Karen to be confirmed in red shoes, as she was now to be. Everybody looked at her feet, and the whole of the way from the church door to the choir it seemed to her as if even the ancient figures on the monuments, in their stiff collars and long black robes, had their eyes fixed on her red shoes. It was only of these that she thought when the clergyman laid his hand upon her head and spoke of the holy baptism, of the covenant with God, and told her that she was now to be a grown-up Christian. The organ pealed forth solemnly, and the sweet children's voices mingled with that of their old leader, but Karen thought only of her red shoes. In the afternoon the old lady heard from everybody that Karen had worn red shoes. She said that it was a shocking thing to do, that it was very improper, and that Karen was always to go to church in future in black shoes. even if they were old. On the following Sunday there was communion. Karen looked first at the black shoes, then at the red ones, looked at the red ones again, and put them on. The sun was shining gloriously, so Karen and the old lady went along the footpath through the corn, where it was rather dusty. At the church door stood an old crippled soldier leaning on a crutch. He had a wonderfully long beard, more red than white, and he bowed down to the ground and asked the old lady whether he might wipe her shoes. Then Karen put out her little foot too. "Dear me, what pretty dancing shoes," said the soldier. "Sit fast, when you dance," said he, addressing the shoes, and slapping the soles with his hand. The old lady gave the soldier some money and then went with Karen into the church, and all the people inside looked at Karen's red shoes, and all the figures gazed at them. When Karen knelt before the altar and put the golden goblet to her mouth, she thought only of the red shoes. It seemed to her as though they were swimming about in the goblet, and she forgot to sing the psalm, forgot to say the Lord's Prayer. Now everyone came out of church, and the old lady stepped into her carriage. But just as Karen was lifting up her foot to get into, the old soldier said, "Dear me, what pretty dancing shoes." And Karen could not help it. She was obliged to dance a few steps, and when she had once begun, her legs continued to dance. It seemed as if the shoes had got power over them. She danced round the church corner, for she could not stop. The coachman had to run after her and seize her. He lifted her into the carriage, but her feet continued to dance, so that she kicked the good old lady violently. At last they took off her shoes, and her legs were at rest. At home the shoes were put into the cupboard, but Karen could not help looking at them. Now the old lady fell ill, and it was said that she would not rise from her bed again. She had to be nursed and waited upon, and this was no one's duty more than Karen's. But there was a grand ball in the town, and Karen was invited. She looked at the red shoes, saying to herself that there was no sin in doing that. She put the red shoes on, thinking there was no harm in that either, and then she went to the ball, and commenced to dance. But when she wanted to go to the right, the shoes danced to the left, and when she wanted to dance up the room, the shoes danced down the room, down the stairs through the street, and out through the gates of the town. She danced, and was obliged to dance, far out into the dark wood. Suddenly something shone up among the trees, and she believed it was the moon, for it was a face. But it was the old soldier with the red beard. He sat there nodding his head and said, "Dear me, what pretty dancing shoes." She was frightened, and wanted to throw the red shoes away, but they stuck fast. She tore off her stockings, but the shoes had grown fast to her feet. She danced and was obliged to go on dancing over field and meadow, in rain and sunshine, by night and by day, but by night it was most horrible. She danced out into the open churchyard, but the dead there did not dance. They had something better to do than that. She wanted to sit down on a pauper's grave where the bitter fern grows, but for her there was neither peace nor rest. And as she danced past the open church door she saw an angel there in long white robes, with wings reaching from his shoulders down to the earth. His face was stern and grave, and in his hand he held a broad shining sword. "Dance you shall," said he, "dance in your red shoes till you are pale and cold, till your skin shrivels up and you are a skeleton. Dance you shall, from door to door, and where proud and wicked children live you shall knock, so that they may hear you and fear you. Dance you shall, dance, mercy," cried Karen. But she did not hear what the angel answered, for the shoes carried her through the gate into the fields, along highways and byways, and unceasingly she had to dance. One morning she danced past a door that she knew well. They were singing a psalm inside, and a coffin was being carried out covered with flowers. Then she knew that she was forsaken by everyone and damned by the angel of God. She danced, and was obliged to go on dancing through the dark night. The shoes bore her away over thorns and stumps till she was all torn and bleeding. She danced away over the heath to a lonely little house. Here, she knew, lived the executioner, and she tapped with her finger at the window and said, "Come out, come out. I cannot come in, for I must dance." And the executioner said, "I don't suppose you know who I am. I strike off the heads of the wicked, and I notice that my axe is tingling to do so." "Don't cut off my head," said Karen, "for then I could not repent of my sin. But cut off my feet with the red shoes." And then she confessed all her sin, and the executioner struck off her feet with the red shoes, but the shoes danced away with the little feet across the field into the deep forest, and he carved her a pair of wooden feet and some crutches, and taught her a psalm which is always sung by sinners. She kissed the hand that guided the axe, and went away over the heath. "Now, I have suffered enough for the red shoes," she said. "I will go to church, so that people can see me." And she went quickly up to the church door, but when she came there, the red shoes were dancing before her, and she was frightened, and turned back. During the whole week she was sad and wept many bitter tears, but when Sunday came again she said, "Now I have suffered and striven enough. I believe I am quite as good as many of those who sit in church and give themselves airs." And so she went boldly on, but she had not got farther than the churchyard gate when she saw the red shoes dancing along before her. Then she became terrified, and turned back and repented right heartily of her sin. She went to the parsonage, and begged that she might be taken into service there. She would be industrious, she said, and do everything that she could. She did not mind about the wages as long as she had a roof over her, and was with good people. The pastor's wife had pity on her, and took her into service. And she was industrious and thoughtful. She sat quiet and listened when the pastor read aloud from the Bible in the evening. All the children liked her very much, but when they spoke about dress and grandeur and beauty she would shake her head. On the following Sunday they all went to church, and she was asked whether she wished to go too, but, with tears in her eyes, she looked sadly at her crutches. And then the others went to hear God's word, but she went alone into her little room. This was only large enough to hold the bed and a chair. Here she sat down with her hymn book, and as she was reading it with a pious mind, the wind carried the notes of the organ over to her from the church, and in tears she lifted up her face and said, "Oh God, help me." Then the sun shone so brightly, and right before her stood an angel of God in white robes. It was the same one whom she had seen that night at the church door. He no longer carried the sharp sword, but a beautiful green branch, full of roses. With this he touched the ceiling, which rose up very high, and where he had touched it there shone a golden star. He touched the walls, which opened wide apart, and she saw the organ which was pealing forth. She saw the pictures of the old pastors and their wives, and the congregation sitting in the polished chairs and singing from their hymn books. The church itself had come to the poor girl in her narrow room, or the room had gone to the church. She sat in the pew with the rest of the pastor's household, and when they had finished the hymn and looked up, they nodded and said, "It was right of you to come, Karen." "It was mercy," said she. The organ played and the children's voices in the choir sounded soft and lovely. The bright warm sunshine streamed through the window into the pew where Karen sat, and her heart became so filled with it, so filled with peace and joy, that it broke. Her soul flew on the sunbeams to heaven, and no one was there who asked after the red shoes. Chapter 87 Everything in the Right Place. It is more than 100 years ago. At the border of the wood, near a large lake, stood the old mansion. Deep ditches surrounded it on every side, in which reeds and bulrushes grew. Close by the drawbridge, near the gate, there was an old willow tree, which bent over the reeds. From the narrow pass came the sound of bugles and the trampling of horses' feet. Therefore a little girl who was watching the geese hastened to drive them away from the bridge, before the whole hunting party came galloping up. They came, however, so quickly, that the girl, in order to avoid being run over, placed herself on one of the high cornerstones of the bridge. She was still half a child and very delicately built. She had bright blue eyes, and a gentle, sweet expression. But such things the Baron did not notice. While he was riding past the little goose girl, he reversed his hunting crop, and in rough play gave her such a push with it that she fell backward into the ditch. "Everything in the right place," he cried. "Into the ditch with you." Then he burst out laughing, for that he called fun. The others joined in, the whole party shouted and cried, while the hounds barked. While the poor girl was falling she happily caught one of the branches of the willow tree, by the help of which she held herself over the water, and as soon as the Baron with his company and the dogs had disappeared through the gate, the girl endeavored to scramble up, but the branch broke off, and she would have fallen backward among the rushes, had not a strong hand from above seized her at this moment. It was the hand of a peddler. He had witnessed what had happened from a short distance, and now hastened to assist her. "Everything in the right place," he said, imitating the noble Baron, and pulling the little maid up to the dry ground. He wished to put the branch back in the place it had been broken off, but it is not possible to put everything in the right place, therefore he stuck the branch into the soft ground. "Grow and thrive if you can, and produce a good flute for them yonder at the mansion," he said. It would have given him great pleasure to see the noble Baron and his companions well thrashed. Then he entered the castle but not the banqueting hall. He was too humble for that. No, he went to the servants' hall. The men servants and maids looked over his stock of articles and bargained with him. Loud crying and screaming were heard from the master's table above. They called it singing indeed. They did their best. Laughter and the howls of dogs were heard through the open windows, that they were feasting and reveling. Wine and strong old ale were foaming in the glasses and jugs. The favorite dogs ate with their masters. Now and then the squires kissed one of these animals, after having wiped its mouth first with the tablecloth. They ordered the peddler to come up, but only to make fun of him. The wine had got into their heads, and reason had left them. They poured beer into a stocking that he could drink with them. But quick. That's what they called fun, and it made them laugh. Then meadows, peasants, and farmyards were staked on one card and lost. Everything in the right place. The peddler said when he had at last safely got out of Sodom and Gomorrah, as he called it. The open high road is my right place. Up there I did not feel at ease. The little maid, who was still watching the geese, nodded kindly to him as he passed through the gate. Days and weeks passed, and it was seen that the broken willow branch which the peddler had stuck into the ground near the ditch remained fresh and green, nay, it even put forth fresh twigs. The little goose girl saw that the branch had taken root, and was very pleased. The tree, so she said, was now her tree. While the tree was advancing, everything else at the castle was going backward, through feasting and gambling. For these are two rollers upon which nobody stands safely. Less than 6 years afterwards the baron passed out of his castle gate a poor beggar, while the baronial seat had been bought by a rich tradesman. He was the very peddler they had made fun of and poured beer into a stocking for him to drink, but honesty and industry bring one forward, and now the peddler was the possessor of the baronial estate. From that time forward no card playing was permitted there. That's a bad pastime, he said. When the devil saw the Bible for the first time he wanted to produce a caricature in opposition to it, and invented card playing. The new proprietor of the estate took a wife, and whom did he take? The little goose girl, who had always remained good and kind, and who looked as beautiful in her new clothes as if she had been a lady of high birth. And how did all this come about? That would be too long a tale to tell in our busy time, but it really happened, and the most important events have yet to be told. It was pleasant and cheerful to live in the old place now. The mother superintended the household, and the father looked after things out of doors, and they were indeed very prosperous. Where honesty leads the way, prosperity is sure to follow. The old mansion was repaired and painted, the ditches were cleaned and fruit trees planted, all was homely and pleasant, and the floors were as white and shining as a pasteboard. In the long winter evenings the mistress and her maids sat at the spinning wheel in the large hall. Every Sunday the counsellor, this title the peddler had obtained, although only in his old days, read aloud a portion from the Bible. The children, for they had children, all received the best education, but they were not all equally clever, as is the case in all families. In the meantime the willow tree near the drawbridge had grown up into a splendid tree, and stood there, free, and was never clipped. It is our genealogical tree, said the old people to their children, and therefore it must be honored. 100 years had elapsed. It was in our own days. The lake had been transformed into marshy land, the whole baronial seat had, as it were, disappeared. A pool of water near some ruined walls was the only remainder of the deep ditches, and here stood a magnificent old tree with overhanging branches. That was the genealogical tree. Here it stood, and showed how beautiful a willow can look if one does not interfere with it. The trunk, it is true, was cleft in the middle from the root to the crown. The storms had bent it a little, but it still stood there, and out of every crevice and cleft, in which wind and weather had carried mold, blades of grass and flowers sprang forth. Especially above, where the large boughs parted, there was quite a hanging garden, in which wild raspberries and hart's-tongue ferns throve, and even a little mistletoe had taken root, and grew gracefully in the old willow branches, which were reflected in the dark water beneath when the wind blew the chickweed into the corner of the pool. A footpath which led across the fields passed close by the old tree. High up, on the woody hillside, stood the new mansion. It had a splendid view, and was large and magnificent. Its window panes were so clear that one might have thought there were none there at all. The large flight of steps which led to the entrance looked like a bower covered with roses and broad-leaved plants. The lawn was as green as if each blade of grass was cleaned separately morning and evening. Inside, in the hall, valuable oil paintings were hanging on the walls. Here stood chairs and sofas covered with silk and velvet, which could be easily rolled about on casters. There were tables with polished marble tops, and books bound in morocco with gilt edges. Indeed, well-to-do and distinguished people lived here. It was the dwelling of the baron and his family. Each article was in keeping with its surroundings. Everything in the right place was the motto according to which they also acted here, and therefore all the paintings which had once been the honor and glory of the old mansion were now hung up in the passage which led to the servants' rooms. It was all old lumber, especially two portraits, one representing a man in a scarlet coat with a wig, and the other a lady with powdered and curled hair holding a rose in her hand, each of them being surrounded by a large wreath of willow branches. Both portraits had many holes in them, because the baron's sons used the two old people as targets for their crossbows. They represented the councillor and his wife, from whom the whole family descended. But they did not properly belong to our family, said one of the boys. He was a peddler and she kept the geese. They were not like Papa and Mama. The portraits were old lumber, and everything in its right place. That was why the great-grandparents had been hung up in the passage leading to the servants' rooms. The son of the village pastor was tutor at the mansion. One day he went for a walk across the fields with his young pupils and their elder sister, who had lately been confirmed. They walked along the road which passed by the old willow tree, and while they were on the road she picked a bunch of field flowers. Everything in the right place, and indeed the bunch looked very beautiful. At the same time she listened to all that was said, and she very much liked to hear the pastor's son speak about the elements and of the great men and women in history. She had a healthy mind, noble in thought and deed, and with a heart full of love for everything that God had created. They stopped at the old willow tree, as the youngest of the Baron's sons wished very much to have a flute from it, such as had been cut for him from other willow trees. The pastor's son broke a branch off. "Oh, pray do not do it," said the young lady, but it was already done. "That is our famous old tree. I love it very much. They often laugh at me at home about it, but that does not matter. There is a story attached to this tree." And now she told him all that we already know about the tree, the old mansion, the peddler and the goose girl who had met there for the first time, and had become the ancestors of the noble family to which the young lady belonged. They did not like to be knighted, the good old people, she said. Their motto was everything in the right place, and it would not be right, they thought, to purchase a title for money. My grandfather, the first Baron, was their son. They say he was a very learned man, a great favorite with the princes and princesses, and was invited to all court festivities. The others at home love him best, but, I do not know why, there seemed to me to be something about the old couple that attracts my heart. How homely, how patriarchal, it must have been in the old mansion, where the mistress sat at the spinning wheel with her maids, while her husband read aloud out of the Bible. They must have been excellent, sensible people, said the pastor's son. And with this the conversation turned naturally to noblemen and commoners. From the manner in which the tutor spoke about the significance of being noble, it seemed almost as if he did not belong to a commoner's family. It is good fortune to be of a family who have distinguished themselves, and to possess as it were a spur in oneself to advance to all that is good. It is a splendid thing to belong to a noble family, whose name serves as a card of admission to the highest circles. Nobility is a distinction, it is a gold coin that bears the stamp of its own value. It is the fallacy of the time, and many poets express it, to say that all that is noble is bad and stupid, and that, on the contrary, the lower one goes among the poor, the more brilliant the virtues one finds. I do not share this opinion, for it is wrong. In the upper classes one sees many touchingly beautiful traits. My own mother has told me of such, and I could mention several. One day she was visiting a nobleman's house in town. My grandmother, I believe, had been the lady's nurse when she was a child. My mother and the nobleman were alone in the room, when he suddenly noticed an old woman on crutches come limping into the courtyard. She came every Sunday to carry a gift away with her. "There is the poor old woman," said the nobleman, "it is so difficult for her to walk." My mother had hardly understood what he said before he disappeared from the room, and went downstairs, in order to save her the troublesome walk for the gift she came to fetch. Of course this is only a little incident, but it has its good sound like the poor widow's two mites in the Bible, the sound which echoes in the depth of every human heart, and this is what the poet ought to show and point out more especially in our own time. He ought to sing of this. It does good, it mitigates and reconciles. But when a man, simply because he is of noble birth and possesses a genealogy, stands on his hind legs and neighs in the street like an Arabian horse, and says when a commoner has been in a room, "Some people from the street have been here," the nobility is decaying, it has become a mask of the kind that Thespis created, and it is amusing when such a person is exposed in satire. Such was the tutor's speech. It was a little long, but while he delivered it he had finished cutting the flute. There was a large party at the mansion. Many guests from the neighborhood and from the capital had arrived. There were ladies with tasteful and with tasteless dresses. The big hall was quite crowded with people. The clergymen stood humbly together in a corner, and looked as if they were preparing for a funeral, but it was a festival, only the amusement had not yet begun. A great concert was to take place, and that is why the Baron's young son had brought his willow flute with him, but he could not make it sound, nor could his father, and therefore the flute was good for nothing. There was music and songs of the kind which delight most those that perform them, otherwise quite charming. "Are you an artist?" said a cavalier, the son of his father. "You play on the flute, you have made it yourself, it is genius that rules, the place of honor is due to you." "Certainly not. I only advance with the time, and that of course one can't help. I hope you will delight us all with a little instrument, will you not?" Thus saying he handed to the tutor the flute which had been cut from the willow tree by the pool. and then announced in a loud voice that the tutor wished to perform a solo on the flute. They wished to tease him, that was evident, and therefore the tutor declined to play, although he could do so very well. They urged and requested him, however, so long, that at last he took up the flute and placed it to his lips. That was a marvelous flute. Its sound was as thrilling as the whistle of a steam engine. In fact, it was much stronger, for it sounded and was heard in the yard, in the garden, in the wood, and many miles round in the country. At the same time a storm rose and roared, everything in the right place. And with this the Baron, as if carried by the wind, flew out of the hall straight into the shepherd's cottage, and the shepherd flew not into the hall, thither he could not come but into the servants' hall, among the smart footmen who were striding about in silk stockings. These haughty menials looked horror-struck that such a person ventured to sit at table with them. But in the hall the Baron's daughter flew to the place of honor at the end of the table. She was worthy to sit there. The pastor's son had the seat next to her. The two sat there as if they were a bridal pair. An old count, belonging to one of the oldest families of the country, remained untouched in his place of honor. The flute was just, and it is one's duty to be so. The sharp-tongued cavalier who had caused the flute to be played, and who was the child of his parents, flew headlong into the fowl house, but not he alone. The flute was heard at a distance of a mile, and strange events took place. A rich banker's family, who were driving in a coach and four, were blown out of it, and could not even find room behind it with their footmen. Two rich farmers who had in our days shot up higher than their own cornfields, were flung into the ditch. It was a dangerous flute. Fortunately it burst at the first sound, and that was a good thing, for then it was put back into its owner's pocket, its right place. The next day, nobody spoke a word about what had taken place. Thus originated the phrase, to pocket the flute. Everything was again in its usual order, except that the two old pictures of the peddler and the goose girl were hanging in the banqueting hall. That they were on the wall as if blown up there, and as a royal expert said that they were painted by a master's hand, they remained there and were restored. Everything in the right place, and to this it will come. Eternity is long, much longer indeed than this story. Chapter 88 A Rose from Homer's Grave. All the songs of the East speak of the love of the nightingale for the rose in the silent starlight night. The winged songster serenades the fragrant flowers. Not far from Smyrna, where the merchant drives his loaded camels, proudly arching their long necks as they journey beneath the lofty pines over holy ground, I saw a hedge of roses. The turtle dove flew among the branches of the tall trees, and as the sunbeams fell upon her wings, they glistened as if they were mother of pearl. On the rose bush grew a flower, more beautiful than them all, and to her the nightingale sung of his woes, but the rose remained silent, not even a dewdrop lay like a tear of sympathy on her leaves. At last she bowed her head over a heap of stones, and said, "Here rests the greatest singer in the world, over his tomb will I spread my fragrance, and on it I will let my leaves fall when the storm scatters them. He who sung of Troy became earth, and from that earth I have sprung. I, a rose from the grave of Homer, am too lofty to bloom for a nightingale." Then the nightingale sang himself to death. A camel driver came by, with his loaded camels and his black slaves. His little son found the dead bird, and buried the lovely songster in the grave of the great Homer, while the rose trembled in the wind. The evening came, and the rose wrapped her leaves more closely round her, and dreamed, and this was her dream. It was a fair sunshiny day. A crowd of strangers drew near who had undertaken a pilgrimage to the grave of Homer. Among the strangers was a minstrel from the north, the home of the clouds and the brilliant lights of the aurora borealis. He plucked the rose and placed it in a book, and carried it away into a distant part of the world, his fatherland. The rose faded with grief, and lay between the leaves of the book, which he opened in his own home, saying, "Here is a rose from the grave of Homer." Then the flower awoke from her dream, and trembled in the wind. A drop of dew fell from the leaves upon the singer's grave. The sun rose, and the flower bloomed more beautiful than ever. The day was hot, and she was still in her own warm Asia. Then footsteps approached, strangers, such as the rose had seen in her dream, came by, and among them was a poet from the north. He plucked the rose, pressed a kiss upon her fresh mouth, and carried her away to the home of the clouds and the northern lights. Like a mummy, the flower now rests in his Iliad, and, as in her dream, she hears him say, as he opens the book, "Here is a rose from the grave of Homer." Chapter 89 The Snail and the Rose Tree. Round about the garden ran a hedge of hazel bushes, beyond the hedge were fields and meadows with cows and sheep, but in the middle of the garden stood a rose tree in bloom, under which sat a snail, whose shell contained a great deal, that is, himself. "Only wait till my time comes," he said. "I shall do more than grow roses, bear nuts, or give milk, like the hazel bush, the cows and the sheep. I expect a great deal from you," said the rose tree. "May I ask when it will appear?" "I take my time," said the snail. "You're always in such a hurry." That does not excite expectation. The following year the snail lay in almost the same spot, in the sunshine under the rose tree, which was again budding and bearing roses as fresh and beautiful as ever. The snail crept half out of his shell, stretched out his horns, and drew them in again. Everything is just as it was last year. No progress at all. The rose tree sticks to its roses and gets no farther. The summer and the autumn passed. The rose tree bore roses and buds till the snow fell and the weather became raw and wet. Then it bent down its head, and the snail crept into the ground. A new year began. The roses made their appearance, and the snail made his too. "You are an old rose tree now," said the snail. "You must make haste and die. You have given the world all that you had in you. Whether it was of much importance is a question that I have not had time to think about. But this much is clear and plain, that you have not done the least for your inner development, or you would have produced something else. Have you anything to say in defense? You will now soon be nothing but a stick. Do you understand what I say?" "You frighten me," said the rose tree. "I have never thought of that." "No, you have never taken the trouble to think at all. Have you ever given yourself an account why you bloomed, and how your blooming comes about? Why just in that way and in no other?" "No," said the rose tree. "I bloom in gladness, because I cannot do otherwise. The sun shone and warmed me, and the air refreshed me. I drank the clear dew and the invigorating rain. I breathed and I lived. Out of the earth there arose a power within me, whilst from above I also received strength. I felt an ever-renewed and ever-increasing happiness, and therefore I was obliged to go on blooming. That was my life, I could not do otherwise." "You have led a very easy life," remarked the snail. "Certainly. Everything was given me," said the rose tree. "But still more was given to you. Yours is one of those deep-thinking natures, one of those highly gifted minds that astonishes the world." "I have not the slightest intention of doing so," said the snail. "The world is nothing to me. What have I to do with the world? I have enough to do with myself, and enough in myself. But must we not all here on earth give up our best parts to others, and offer as much as lies in our power? It is true, I have only given roses. But you who are so richly endowed, what have you given to the world? What will you give it? What have I given? What am I going to give? I spit at it, it's good for nothing, and does not concern me. For my part, you may go on bearing roses, you cannot do anything else. Let the hazel bush bear nuts, and the cows and sheep give milk, they have each their public. I have mine in myself. I retire within myself and there I stop. The world is nothing to me." With this the snail withdrew into his house and blocked up the entrance. "That's very sad," said the rose tree. "I cannot creep into myself, however much I might wish to do so. I have to go on bearing roses. Then they drop their leaves, which are blown away by the wind. But I once saw how a rose was laid in the mistress's hymn book, and how one of my roses found a place in the bosom of a young beautiful girl, and how another was kissed by the lips of a child in the glad joy of life. That did me good, it was a real blessing. Those are my recollections, my life." And the rose tree went on blooming in innocence, while the snail lay idling in his house. The world was nothing to him. Years passed by, the snail had turned to earth in the earth, and the rose tree too. Even the souvenir rose in the hymn book was faded, but in the garden there were other rose trees and other snails. The latter crept into their houses and spat at the world, for it did not concern them. Shall we read the story all over again? It will be just the same. Chapter 90. The story of a mother. A mother sat by her little child. She was very sad, for she feared it would die. It was quite pale, and its little eyes were closed, and sometimes it drew a heavy deep breath, almost like a sigh, and then the mother gazed more sadly than ever on the poor little creature. Someone knocked at the door, and a poor old man walked in. He was wrapped in something that looked like a great horse cloth, and he required it truly to keep him warm, for it was cold winter. The country everywhere lay covered with snow and ice, and the wind blew so sharply that it cut one's face. The little child had dozed off to sleep for a moment, and the mother, seeing that the old man shivered with the cold, rose and placed a small mug of beer on the stove to warm for him. The old man sat and rocked the cradle, and the mother seated herself on a chair near him, and looked at her sick child who still breathed heavily, and took hold of its little hand. "You think I shall keep him, do you not?" she said. "Our all-merciful God will surely not take him away from me." The old man, who was indeed death himself, nodded his head in a peculiar manner, which might have signified either yes or no, and the mother cast down her eyes, while the tears rolled down her cheeks. Then her head became heavy, for for she had not closed her eyes for 3 days and nights, and she slept, but only for a moment. Shivering with cold, she started up and looked round the room. The old man was gone, and her child it was gone too! The old man had taken it with him. In the corner of the room the old clocks began to strike. Whir went the chains, the heavy weight sank to the ground, and the clock stopped, and the poor mother rushed out of the house calling for her child. Out in the snow sat a woman in long black garments, and she said to the mother, "Death has been with you in your room. I saw him hastening away with your little child. He strides faster than the wind, and never brings back what he has taken away. Only tell me which way he has gone," said the mother. "Tell me the way, I will find him." "I know the way," said the woman in the black garments, "but before I tell you, you must sing to me all the songs that you have sung to your child." "I love these songs, I have heard them before. I am night, and I saw your tears flow as you sang. I will sing them all to you," said the mother, "but do not detain me now. I must overtake him, and find my child." But Night sat silent and still. Then the mother wept and sang, and wrung her hands. And there were many songs, and yet even more tears, till at length Night said, "Go to the right, into the dark forest of fir trees, for I saw Death take that road with your little child." Within the wood the mother came to crossroads, and she knew not which to take. Just by stood a thorn bush. It had neither leaf nor flower, for it was the cold winter time, and icicles hung on the branches. "Have you not seen Death go by, with my little child?" she asked. "Yes," replied the thorn bush, "but I will not tell you which way he has taken until you have warmed me in your bosom. I am freezing to death here, and turning to ice." Then she pressed the bramble to her bosom quite close, so that it might be thawed, and the thorns pierced her flesh, and great drops of blood flowed, but the bramble shot forth fresh green leaves, and they became flowers on the cold winter's night, so warm is the heart of a sorrowing mother. Then the bramble bush told her the path she must take. She came at length to a great lake, on which there was neither ship nor boat to be seen. The lake was not frozen sufficiently for her to pass over on the ice, nor was it open enough for her to wade through, and yet she must cross it, if she wished to find her child. Then she laid herself down to drink up the water of the lake, which was of course impossible for any human being to do, but the bereaved mother thought that perhaps a miracle might take place to help her. "You will never succeed in this," said the lake. "Let us make an agreement together which will be better. I love to collect pearls, and your eyes are the purest I have ever seen. If you will weep those eyes away in tears into my waters, then I will take you to the large hothouse where Death dwells and rears flowers and trees, every one of which is a human life. Oh, what would I not give to reach my child?" said the weeping mother, and as she still continued to weep, her eyes fell into the depths of the lake, and became 2 costly pearls. Then the lake lifted her up, and wafted her across to the opposite shore as if she were on a swing, where stood a wonderful building many miles in length. No one could tell whether it was a mountain covered with forests and full of caves, or whether it had been built. But the poor mother could not see, for she had wept her eyes into the lake. "Where shall I find Death, who went away with my little child?" she asked. "He has not arrived here yet," said an old gray-haired woman, who was walking about, and watering Death's hothouse. "How have you found your way here? And who helped you?" "God has helped me," she replied. "He is merciful, will you not be merciful too?" "Where shall I find my little child?" "I did not know the child," said the old woman, "and you are blind. Many flowers and trees have faded tonight, and Death will soon come to transplant them. You know already that every human being has a life tree or a life flower, just as may be ordained for him. They look like other plants, but they have hearts that beat. Children's hearts also beat, from that you may perhaps be able to recognize your child. But what will you give me, if I tell you what more you will have to do?" "I have nothing to give," said the afflicted mother, "but I would go to the ends of the earth for you." "I can give you nothing to do for me there," said the old woman, "but you can give me your long black hair. You know yourself that it is beautiful, and it pleases me. You can take my white hair in exchange, which will be something in return. Do you ask nothing more than that?" said she. "I will give it to you with pleasure," and she gave up her beautiful hair, and received in return the white locks of the old woman. Then they went into Death's vast hothouse, where flowers and trees grew together in wonderful profusion. Blooming hyacinths, under glass bells, and peonies, like strong trees. There grew water plants, some quite fresh, and others looking sickly, which had water snakes twining round them, and black crabs clinging to their stems. There stood noble palm trees, oaks, and plantains, and beneath them bloomed thyme and parsley. Each tree and flower had a name, each represented a human life, and belonged to men still living, some in China, others in Greenland, and in all parts of the world. Some large trees had been planted in little pots, so that they were cramped for room, and seemed about to burst the pot to pieces, while many weak little flowers were growing in rich soil, with moss all around them, carefully tended and cared for. The sorrowing mother bent over the little plants, and heard the human heart beating in each, and recognized the beatings of her child's heart among millions of others. "That is it," she cried, stretching out her hand towards a little crocus flower which hung down its sickly head. "Do not touch the flower," exclaimed the old woman, "but place yourself here, and when death comes I expect him every minute. Do not let him pull up that plant, but threaten him that if he does you will serve the other flowers in the same manner. This will make him afraid, for he must account to God for each of them. None can be uprooted, unless he receives permission to do so." There rushed through the hothouse a chill of icy coldness, and the blind mother felt that death had arrived. "How did you find your way hither?" asked he. "How could you come here faster than I have?" "I am a mother," she answered, and Death stretched out his hand towards the delicate little flower, but she held her hands tightly round it, and held it fast at the same time, with the most anxious care, lest she should touch one of the leaves. Then Death breathed upon her hands, and she felt his breath colder than the icy wind, and her hands sank down powerless. "You cannot prevail against me," said Death. "But a God of mercy can," said she. "I only do his will," replied Death. "I am his gardener. I take all his flowers and trees, and transplant them into the gardens of paradise in an unknown land. How they flourish there, and what that garden resembles, I may not tell you." "Give me back my child," said the mother, weeping and imploring, and she seized two beautiful flowers in her hands, and cried to Death, "I will tear up all your flowers, for I am in despair." "Do not touch them," said Death. "You say you are unhappy, and would you make another mother as unhappy as yourself?" "Another mother!" cried the poor woman, setting the flowers free from her hands. "There are your eyes," said Death. "I fished them up out of the lake for you. They were shining brightly, but I knew not they were yours. Take them back, they are clearer now than before, and then look into the deep well which is close by here. I will tell you the names of the two flowers which you wished to pull up, and you will see the whole future of the human beings they represent, and what you were about to frustrate and destroy." Then she looked into the well, and it was a glorious sight to behold how one of them became a blessing to the world, and how much happiness and joy it spread around. But she saw that the life of the other was full of care and poverty, misery and woe. "Both are the will of God," said Death. "Which is the unhappy flower, and which is the blessed one?" She said. "That I may not tell you," said Death, "but thus far you may learn, that one of the two flowers represents your own child. It was the fate of your child that you saw, the future of your own child." Then the mother screamed aloud with terror, "Which of them belongs to my child? Tell me that. Deliver the unhappy child. Release it from so much misery. Rather take it away. Take it to the kingdom of God. Forget my tears and my entreaties, forget all that I have said or done." "I do not understand you," said Death. "Will you have your child back? Or shall I carry him away to a place that you do not know?" Then the mother wrung her hands, fell on her knees, and prayed to God. "Grant not my prayers, when they are contrary to thy will, which at all times must be the best. Oh, hear them not," and her head sank on her bosom. Then Death carried away her child to the unknown land,